Imagine a 13-year-old girl sitting alone in a roadside diner at 2 in the morning. She hasn't touched her hot chocolate. She hasn't cried. She hasn't asked a single person for help. But when a 6'4" biker covered in scars and engine grease walks past her booth, she whispers 5 words that will destroy a conspiracy worth millions. They're lying to you. She wasn't talking about strangers. She was talking about the professionals walking through the door behind him, the therapist, the attorney, the child services supervisor, every one of them paid to make her disappear. What happens next will shatter everything you think you know about who protects children in this country. Stay with this story until the very end. If it hits you, drop a like, leave a comment, and tell us what city you're watching from right now. The storm came sideways. Not the kind of rain that washes things clean, the kind that punishes. Sheets of frozen water slamming against asphalt like the sky had a grudge against everything still moving beneath it. The kind of autumn storm that strips the last leaves from dead trees and sends them skidding across empty highways like small animals fleeing something bigger than themselves. Black Hollow sat 40 miles from anything that mattered. A mining town that stopped mining 20 years ago and never figured out what to do next. Half the storefronts on Main Street had plywood where glass used to be. The streetlights worked every third block. The only business that stayed open past midnight was a roadside diner called Marcy's, wedged between a shuttered hardware store and a gravel lot where truckers sometimes slept in their cabs when the weather turned ugly. Tonight the weather had turned murderous. Ronan Voss killed the engine on his Harley and sat for a moment in the parking lot, rain hammering the back of his neck, soaking through the collar of his leather jacket into the thermal underneath. His hands were still shaking from the cold. Not the kind of shaking that stops when you get warm. The kind that lives in your bones from years of gripping things too hard. Handlebars, rifle stocks, the edge of a hospital bed where someone you loved stopped breathing. He was 46 years old, 6'4", 240 pounds of scar tissue, engine grease, and damage that didn't show on x-rays. People called him Grizzly, and he let them, because the nickname kept strangers from asking questions he didn't want to answer. His beard was streaked with gray. His knuckles were permanently swollen from breaks that never healed right. Across his left forearm ran a jagged scar from a piece of shrapnel that found him in Fallujah 14 years ago. A scar he never covered because covering it felt like lying about where he'd been. He swung off the bike and walked toward the diner's entrance, boots heavy on the wet gravel. The neon sign above the door buzzed and flickered. Marcy's, with the A burned out so it read MRCY's. Like even the sign couldn't be bothered to hold itself together in a town like this. He'd been riding since dawn, 11 hours. No destination, just distance. That was the deal he made with himself 3 years ago when he left the last motorcycle club he'd ever patch into, the Iron Meridian out of Western Virginia. Not because they betrayed him, because he couldn't sit at a table with brothers anymore without seeing the faces of the ones who didn't come home. Not from combat, from the slower war that waited for them after. Pills, bottles, garage doors closed with engines running. He didn't talk about it. He just rode. Tonight he'd stopped because a trucker's rig had thrown a belt on the shoulder of Route 9, and Ronan spent 40 minutes in the rain helping the man get it patched enough to limp to the next service station. The trucker offered him cash. Ronan told him to buy his kid something instead. The trucker said he didn't have kids. Ronan said nothing else and rode until the diner appeared through the rain like a lifeboat no one was steering. Inside, Marcy's smelled like burnt coffee, bacon grease, and the particular sadness of fluorescent lighting at 2 in the morning. A counter with 8 stools, 6 booths along the window, a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. 2 truckers sat at the counter hunched over plates of eggs. A waitress in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck moved between them with a coffee pot that never seemed to empty. Ronan took the last stool at the far end of the counter, closest to the kitchen door and farthest from the entrance. Old habit. Marines sit where they can see every exit and reach none of them too quickly. He ordered black coffee and a plate of whatever was hot. The waitress, her name tag said Darlene, looked at him the way small-town people look at bikers, like he was something the storm dragged in that she'd have to mop up later. He didn't care. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and let the heat crawl into his fingers. That's when he saw the girl. She was sitting in the booth closest to the restroom hallway, alone. A cup of hot chocolate sat in front of her, untouched, a film of cold skin forming across the surface. She wore a gray hoodie 2 sizes too big, the sleeves pulled down past her wrists. Her dark hair hung in damp strings across her face. She couldn't have been older than 13. She wasn't crying. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't doing any of the things a kid alone in a diner at 2 in the morning should be doing. She was sitting perfectly still and watching the front door. Not casually, not the way someone watches for a friend, the way a deer watches a tree line. Total stillness. Total readiness. Every muscle in her small body coiled around a single question that she'd clearly been asking herself for a long time. Who's coming through that door next? Ronan looked away, drank his coffee, told himself it wasn't his business, told himself a lot of things. He was good at that, building walls out of logic so he didn't have to feel what was leaking through the cracks. But he'd been trained to notice things most people missed, and 3 things about this girl didn't fit. First, the hot chocolate. It had been sitting long enough to go cold, which meant she'd been here at least 30 minutes. No parent, no guardian, no one checking on her. Darlene hadn't spoken to her once. Either nobody noticed or nobody wanted to get involved. Second, her hands. She kept them flat on the table, fingers spread, like she was ready to push off and run at any second. That wasn't anxiety, that was practice. Someone had taught this girl, or life had taught her, that the distance between sitting down and sprinting was measured in fractions of seconds. Third, her eyes. She wasn't looking at faces, she was counting bodies. Every time the door opened or someone moved, her gaze tracked the movement, calculated the geometry of the room, then returned to the door. She was mapping escape routes the way Ronan had been trained to map them in buildings where people shot at you. A 13-year-old girl shouldn't know how to do that. He stood up, told himself he was going to the restroom, walked past her booth slowly, not looking at her directly, giving her space, giving her the choice to ignore him. She didn't ignore him. As he passed within 3 feet of her, she barely moved her lips. Her voice was so quiet it almost disappeared beneath the hum of the overhead lights. "They're lying to you." Ronan stopped walking. His boots went still on the cracked linoleum. He didn't turn, didn't look down, just stood there, facing the hallway, his back half turned to the booth. His voice came out low, rough. The voice of a man who'd spent more time talking to engines than people. "Who is?" The girl's breath hitched, just slightly, like she'd been holding it for weeks and the act of someone simply asking cracked something open inside her chest. "They all say they're trying to save me," she whispered, "but they're the ones I need saving from." The words landed in Ronan's chest like a round he didn't see coming. He knew that sentence, not the words, the architecture of it. The careful construction of someone who has rehearsed their truth so many times, it comes out flat, polished smooth by repetition and terror. She'd been waiting to say this to someone. Maybe anyone. Maybe the first person who didn't look like the people she was afraid of. And the people she was afraid of didn't look like bikers. He turned his head just enough to see her face. Up close, past the curtain of wet hair, he could see things the distance had hidden. A faint bruise along her jawline, yellowing at the edges. At least a week old. A raw red mark on the inside of her left wrist, barely visible beneath the cuff of her sleeve. And her eyes. Brown, clear, fierce in a way that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with survival. This girl wasn't broken. She was holding herself together with nothing but willpower and fury. Before he could say another word, headlights swept across the diner's front windows. 3 vehicles pulled into the parking lot, not together, but close enough that the timing wasn't accidental. A silver Lexus SUV, a black BMW sedan, a white county vehicle with a government plate. The girl's entire body changed. The stillness shattered. Her fingers curled into fists on the table. Her breathing went shallow. Her eyes locked on the door with the fixed intensity of someone watching a trap close around them. "They're here," she said. Not to Ronan, to herself, like a prisoner hearing the guard's boots in the corridor. Ronan sat down across from her in the booth. He didn't ask permission. He didn't explain. He just sat, put his scarred hands flat on the table, mirroring her, and said one thing. "I'm not going anywhere." The front door opened. 3 adults entered together, shedding reign and authority in equal measure. The first was a woman in her early 50s, tailored coat, expensive haircut, The kind of composure that came from controlling rooms full of people who didn't realize they were being controlled. She carried a leather briefcase and moved with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this entrance. Behind her came a man in his late 40s, gray suit, no tie, a face designed for courtrooms. He had the easy confidence of someone who'd never lost an argument because he'd never argued fairly. His eyes scanned the diner the way a buyer scans property. Everything in it already belonged to him. The people inside just hadn't been informed yet. The third was another woman, younger, early 30s, wearing a county lanyard and carrying a manila folder thick enough to choke on. She looked tired. She looked like she'd been told exactly what to say and was trying to remember all of it. The older woman spotted Lena immediately. Her face performed a flawless transition from concern to relief, eyes softening, shoulders dropping, mouth curving into a smile that had all the warmth of a calculated equation. "Lena," her voice carried across the diner. Practiced, musical. The voice of someone trained to sound like safety. "Sweetheart, we've been looking everywhere for you." Lena didn't move, didn't respond, didn't even blink. But beneath the table, Ronan felt her foot press against his boot. Not a kick, not an accident, a signal. The kind of wordless communication that exists between people who know that speaking out loud can get you hurt. The three adults approached the booth. The attorney spoke first, his gaze settling on Ronan with the practiced dismissal of someone who'd spent decades deciding who mattered and who didn't. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Customer," Ronan said. "This is a private matter involving a minor in state custody. I'm going to need you to—" "I'm a customer," Ronan repeated, "sitting in a booth, drinking coffee I paid for." The attorney's jaw tightened. He turned to the older woman, the therapist, Ronan guessed, and she stepped forward, extending her hand like a business card made of flesh. "I'm Dr. Vivian Cross. I'm Lena's trauma therapist. And this is Gerald Hatch, legal counsel for her family's estate, and Supervisor Renee Dalton from County Child Protective Services." She gestured to the younger woman, who clutched her folder like a shield. "Lena has been through an incredibly difficult time since her father's death. She's suffering from acute trauma-related dissociation, and I'm afraid she's had an episode tonight." Every word sounded reasonable. Every word sounded like help. Lena's foot pressed harder against Ronan's boot. Dr. Cross sat down in the booth behind them, turning to face Ronan with the patient expression of someone explaining something to a child. "She sometimes runs. It's part of her condition. She becomes confused, makes allegations." "She hasn't made any allegations," Ronan said. Dr. Cross blinked. Just once, the micro-expression of a script being interrupted. "Well, she will. It's what she does. The important thing is getting her back to a stable environment where—" "Where is that?" Ronan asked. "Excuse me? The stable environment, where is it?" Gerald Hatch stepped closer. "Mr. Voss. Mr. Voss, I understand this looks concerning, but Lena's stepfather, Martin Eckhart, is her legal guardian. He's been awarded temporary custody by the county court. Here." He produced a folded document from his breast pocket and laid it on the table like a winning hand. "Court order, signed by Judge Waring." Ronan didn't touch the paper. He looked at it the way you look at a locked door when you know what's behind it. "And here," Hatch produced another document. "Dr. Cross's clinical evaluation. Lena has been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, compounded by grief psychosis following her father's death 6 months ago." Ronan looked at the papers, then at Lena, then at the three adults standing over a 13-year-old girl in a diner at 2 a.m. during a storm. "You drove here together," he said quietly. Silence. "A therapist, a lawyer, and a CPS supervisor drove to a roadside diner in the middle of the night in the same 15-minute window." He paused. "For a confused child having an episode." Dr. Cross's smile didn't waver, but something behind it shifted. A recalculation. The kind that happens when a person trained to control narratives encounters someone who reads between the lines. "We were already coordinating on Lena's case when the alert came in. Renee received a call from—" "Who called?" Ronan asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Supervisor Dalton spoke for the first time, her voice thin. "The diner. Someone from the diner called the county helpline, and no one here called anyone," Darlene's voice cut from behind the counter, flat and unimpressed. I've been here since 6. Nobody made any calls about that girl. She walked in, sat down, I brought her hot chocolate. That's the whole story. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, the kind that settles over a room when a lie gets caught in daylight and everyone present has to decide what to do with it. Hatch recovered first. Well, regardless of how the notification occurred, the legal situation is clear. Lena is a minor under court-ordered guardianship, and she needs to be returned to her custodial home. If you continue to interfere, I'm sitting in a booth. You're obstructing, I'm drinking coffee, in a booth, in a public diner. Ronan's voice hadn't risen, hadn't changed pitch, but the temperature at the table had dropped 10 degrees. If you want to call the sheriff, call the sheriff. I'll still be here when he arrives. Hatch pulled out his phone. Ronan didn't flinch, but Lena did something no one expected. She reached across the table and placed her hand flat on top of the court documents, not pushing them away, not tearing them up, just covering them, her small hand on top of the legal architecture that was supposedly protecting her. She looked directly at Supervisor Dalton, not at the therapist, not at the attorney, at the youngest person in the conspiracy, the one who still looked like she might have a conscience left. Renee, Lena said quietly, how much is he paying you? Dalton's face went white, not red, not flushed with indignation, white, the color of someone whose skeleton has just been displayed in a room full of people. Dr. Cross moved immediately, stepping between Lena and Dalton like a surgeon cutting off blood flow to a wound. This is exactly the kind of dissociative episode I described. She fixates on perceived threats and constructs, I didn't ask you, Lena said. 3 words, spoken without volume, without drama, with the exhausted precision of a child who has been talked over, talked about, diagnosed, medicated, documented, and filed away by adults who needed her silent. The diner had gone completely still. The 2 truckers at the counter had stopped eating. Darlene stood with the coffee pot frozen mid-pour. Even the rain outside seemed to pause, as if the storm itself wanted to hear what came next. Ronan watched all 3 adults, not their faces, their hands. Dr. Cross's left hand had moved to the clasp of her briefcase. Hatch's fingers were curled around his phone so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. Dalton was gripping her folder against her chest like she was trying to hold her ribcage closed. These weren't the postures of professionals responding to a child in crisis. These were the postures of people whose plan was falling apart. Headlights again. A county sheriff's cruiser pulled into the lot, light bar dark, engine rumbling. A man in a brown uniform pushed through the front door, mid-50s, thick mustache. The tired authority of someone who'd been doing this job long enough to hate it, but not long enough to quit. Sheriff Briggs, Hatch said, stepping forward with his hand extended and his courtroom voice activated. Thank you for responding so quickly. We have a situation with a minor. I can see that. Briggs didn't shake the hand. He looked past Hatch to the booth where a scarred biker sat across from a 13-year-old girl who looked like she hadn't slept in days. His gaze moved between them, calculating. Sir, Briggs said to Ronan, you know this girl? Met her 10 minutes ago. You have any legal relationship to her? No. Then I'm going to need you to step away so I can... Sheriff. Ronan's voice was quiet, level. The voice of a man who had stood in front of things much worse than a county sheriff and hadn't moved. I've got no legal claim, no authority, no standing, I know that. He paused. Let the silence work. But I've got eyes, and something about this doesn't add up. Briggs looked at him, then at the 3 professionals, then at the girl. What doesn't add up? They showed up together, middle of the night. Nobody called them, and every time the girl tries to speak, one of them interrupts her. Briggs turned to Dr. Cross. Ma'am, who contacted you about the girl's location? As I explained to Mr. Voss, we were already coordinating when... Who contacted you? The question landed like a gavel. Dr. Cross's composure held, but the rhythm was off now, half a beat too slow. The gap between question and answer that professionals learn to fear. Martin Eckhart, her stepfather, he has a GPS tracker linked to a GPS tracker, Ronan said, on a 13-year-old. It's a standard safety measure for minors with With what? A tendency to run from the people who are supposed to be protecting her? Briggs held up a hand. The diner fell silent again. He looked at Lena directly, and to his credit, he crouched slightly so he wasn't towering over her. His voice softened, but only by a degree, enough to show he was trying, not enough to condescend. "Young lady, do you want to go with these people?" Dr. Cross started to speak. Briggs silenced her with a look that could have stopped traffic. Lena stared at the sheriff, measured him, weighed him against every adult who had failed her. Then she answered with a single slow shake of her head. "She's not competent to—" Hatch began. "I asked the child a question," Briggs said. "I'm waiting for her answer, not yours." Lena opened her mouth, closed it. Her jaw trembled, not from cold, from the physical effort of pushing words past months of enforced silence. "My dad," she said. Her voice cracked on the word. "My dad tried to tell people before he died. He tried to tell everyone. No one listened." "Lena, sweetheart," Dr. Cross moved toward the booth. "Don't." Ronan's voice was a wall. One word, and Dr. Cross stopped mid-step. Briggs looked at Ronan, looked at the girl. Something shifted behind his eyes, the slow, grinding machinery of a man who'd seen enough lies to recognize the architecture of truth. "What did your father try to tell people, Lena?" She reached for her backpack on the seat beside her. Every adult in the room tensed. Dr. Cross's hand went to Hatch's arm. Dalton took a step backward, her folder dropping an inch. Lena unzipped the small front pocket. Then she reached inside the lining. Not the pocket itself, but a seam she'd carefully opened and restitched by hand, invisible unless you knew where to look. She pulled out a voice recorder. Small, black, the kind journalists used to use. A piece of hardware at least 5 years old, its casing scratched and worn, a strip of electrical tape holding the battery cover in place. She set it on the table between the cold hot chocolate and the court documents. "My dad hid this," she said, "before he died. He told me where to find it. He told me to wait for someone who would listen before they judged." She looked at Ronan. "He said I'd know them by what they don't say." Ronan felt something crack open in his chest. Not pain, something older than pain. The memory of another child, years ago, a boy in a group home who'd tried to tell Ronan something, and Ronan had walked away because the adults in charge looked professional and sounded convincing, and the paperwork was all in order. He never found out what happened to that boy. He'd spent every day since carrying the weight of not knowing. Lena pressed play. The recorder hissed, static, then a man's voice, thin, exhausted, the voice of someone recording in secret at 3 a.m, a voice that shook with the particular terror of a father who has discovered exactly what is being done to his daughter and knows he may not survive long enough to stop it. The first words cut through the diner like a blade, and every professional standing in that room stopped breathing. The voice on the recorder belonged to a dead man, and every living person in that diner knew it. The static crackled and popped like a fire eating through old wood, and then David Mercer's voice filled the silence, raw, unsteady, recorded in what sounded like a closet or a bathroom, with the fan running to mask the sound. The acoustics were tight, claustrophobic, the voice of a man whispering because the walls had ears, and the ears belonged to people who wanted him quiet. "This is David Mercer. It's November 14th, 3:17 a.m. I'm recording this because I don't think I'm going to be alive much longer, and my daughter needs someone to know what's happening to her." Dr. Vivian Cross moved first. Not toward the recorder, toward Lena. Her hand reached for the girl's shoulder with the precision of a woman who had spent years perfecting the gesture. The therapeutic touch, the calming pressure, the physical language of control disguised as comfort. Ronan's hand intercepted hers 6 inches from Lena's body. He didn't grab it, didn't squeeze, just placed his palm flat in the space between the woman's manicured fingers and the girl's shoulder, the way you'd place a wall where a door used to be. "Don't touch her." Cross pulled her hand back. Her eyes met Ronan's, and for the first time the mask slipped, just a millimeter, just for a heartbeat. And behind the professional composure was something cold and calculating and deeply, fundamentally furious. The recording continued. "Martin married my ex-wife 3 years ago. After the divorce, I found out he wasn't who he said he was. His real name isn't Martin Eckhart. He changed it legally in 2014 from Martin Dressler. He ran a property acquisition firm in the Midwest that was shut down for fraud. He targets families with land assets. That's what he does. That's what he's always done. Sheriff Briggs had gone very still. His hand rested on his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough. His eyes moved between the recorder and the three professionals with the slow, grinding calculation of a man reassembling a puzzle he'd been looking at upside down. My daughter Lana is the sole beneficiary of my estate. My parents left everything to her in trust, including 400 acres north of Black Hollow. I didn't think anything of it until Martin started pushing for psychological evaluations. He wanted her declared incompetent. He wanted guardianship transferred. He brought in a therapist, a woman named Vivian Cross, and within 3 sessions, my daughter had a diagnosis I'd never heard of and a treatment plan that included residential placement. Hatch's phone was in his hand. His thumb moved across the screen with the frantic energy of a man sending a message he needed someone to receive before the next sentence played. The land has mineral deposits, rare earth minerals. I had it surveyed independently. The results came back worth, I don't even know how to say this number, worth enough that people would kill for it, and I think that's exactly what's going to happen to me. The recording paused, a shaky breath, the sound of a man pressing his palm over his mouth to keep from crying. If you're hearing this, it means my daughter found you, and if she found you, it means she trusts you. Lena doesn't trust anyone unless they earn it, so whoever you are, please don't let them take her. The recorder clicked. Silence. The diner existed in a vacuum for 3 full seconds. No one breathed. The rain outside hammered the windows, and the fluorescent lights hummed their flat, indifferent hymn, and somewhere in the kitchen a timer went off and nobody moved to answer it. Lena sat with her hands flat on the table. Her eyes were dry. She had listened to her dead father's voice without flinching, without breaking, with the terrifying composure of a child who had played this recording alone in the dark so many times that the grief had been sanded down to something harder than grief, something that functioned, something that kept her moving. Sheriff Briggs spoke first. How many recordings are on that device? 43, Lena said. 43. He recorded every conversation, every phone call with Martin, every meeting with Dr. Cross, every time someone from CPS came to the house. She paused. He knew they'd say he was paranoid, so he recorded everything. Briggs looked at Cross, at Hatch, at Dalton. His expression hadn't changed, but the quality of his attention had. The way a man looks at furniture differently when he discovers it's been rearranged to hide a stain on the floor. I'm going to need that device, Briggs said. No. Ronan's voice came flat and immediate. Not aggressive, final. It stays with her. Mr. Voss, this is evidence in what's potentially, it's the only thing keeping her safe. You take it, it disappears. Evidence rooms lose things. Hard drives get corrupted. Chain of custody gets compromised. Ronan didn't blink. You want to investigate? Investigate. But the recorder stays with the girl until there's someone in this county I trust enough to hand it to. And right now, I haven't met that person. Briggs's jaw tightened. His mustache moved the way a man's mustache moves when he's biting down on words he wants to say, but knows he shouldn't. You don't get to make that call. I just did. The standoff lasted 4 seconds. 5. Long enough for everyone in the diner to understand that something had shifted in the room's power structure, that a biker with no legal authority and no badge had drawn a line that a sheriff wasn't sure he could cross. Hatch broke the silence. Sheriff, I need to advise you that this man has no standing whatsoever. He's a stranger who inserted himself into a custodial matter. The recordings, if they're even authentic, were obtained without consent and are inadmissible under state wiretapping statutes. And the girl has a documented history of, documented by you, Ronan said, documented by qualified medical professionals. Professionals who drove here together at 2 a.m. without being called. The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Hatch turned to Briggs. Sheriff, I'm formally requesting that you enforce the court order and return Lena to her legal guardian's custody. If you refuse, I'll have Judge Waring on the phone within the hour. Briggs looked at the court documents on the table, looked at the recorder, looked at Lena, who was watching him with the patient, exhausted expression of someone who had watched adults fail her so many times that she'd stopped being surprised by it and started being curious about whether this one would be different. "I'm not releasing the girl tonight," Briggs said. Hatch's expression didn't change, but the air around him did. The temperature dropped. The courtesy evaporated. What remained was the skeleton of a man who was used to winning and had just been told he might not. "You're making a significant mistake, Sheriff." "I've made plenty. One more won't kill me." Briggs turned to Dalton. "Supervisor, I'm going to need your documentation on Lena's case, all of it, and I want a copy of the original guardianship petition." Dalton's hands were shaking. The manila folder trembled against her chest. She looked at Cross, then at Hatch, then at the floor. The trajectory of a woman searching for permission from the people who owned her and finding only the cold tiles of a roadside diner. I can have those sent to your office in the morning. I want them tonight." I don't have access to the digital files from here, and you brought a folder." Briggs pointed at it. "What's in the folder?" Dalton clutched it tighter. "Case notes, preliminary assessments." "Hand it over." She didn't move. "Supervisor Dalton, hand it over." The folder transferred from her hands to his like a confession passing between two people who both knew what it contained. Briggs opened it under the diner's lights, and Ronan watched his eyes move down the first page, then stop, then move back to the top and read again. Then look up at Dalton with an expression Ronan recognized, the expression of a man who has just realized he's standing on something rotten. "These notes are dated before the guardianship hearing." Dalton said nothing. "They're dated 2 months before Martin Eckhart even filed for custody. You were documenting Lena's case before there was a case." The silence in the diner was absolute. Cross stepped forward, and for the first time she dropped the therapeutic voice entirely. What replaced it was something colder, more efficient. The voice of a woman who had built her career on being the smartest person in any room and was now calculating the cost of being wrong. "Sheriff, I think we all need to take a breath. This situation has become highly emotional, and there's a very real risk of re-traumatizing Lena by—" "Ma'am, sit down." Cross didn't sit. "Sit down." She sat. In the booth behind Ronan and Lena, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, with the rigid discipline of someone who had been trained to appear calm while everything inside her was reorganizing. Briggs pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Briggs. I need 2 deputies at Marcy's Diner on Route 9. Non-emergency, but I need them now." The radio crackled back, acknowledged. Briggs turned to Ronan. His expression was complicated, not friendly, not hostile, something between the two that lived in the space where old lawmen kept their instincts. "I'm not going to release the girl to them tonight, but you need to understand something. You have no authority here, none. If you interfere with my investigation—" "I'm not going to interfere with your investigation." Ronan paused. "But I'm not leaving this diner until she does." Briggs studied him. The scars, the leather, the size of him, the stillness that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with discipline, the kind of stillness you learn when moving at the wrong time gets people killed. "You a vet?" "Marines, 2 tours." Something shifted behind Briggs's eyes. The microscopic recalibration that happens between men who have served when they recognize each other across a room. Not respect exactly. Recognition. The acknowledgement of a shared language that civilians would never understand. "Stay in the booth," Briggs said. "Don't touch anyone. Don't threaten anyone." "I haven't touched anyone. I haven't threatened anyone." "I know. Keep it that way." Briggs turned away and walked to the counter where Darlene was standing with her coffee pot and her reading glasses and the kind of expression that said she'd seen enough of Black Hollow's business to fill a book she'd never write. Ronan exhaled. Slowly. The kind of exhale that comes from somewhere deeper than lungs. From the place where tension lives in your body like a second skeleton, holding you upright when everything else wants to fold. He looked at Lena. She was staring at the recorder on the table. "How long have you been running?" he asked. 6 months. Her voice was flat, factual. "Since Dad died." "How did he die?" "They said it was an accident. His car went off a bridge on Highway 7. Single vehicle. No witnesses." She paused. "He didn't drink. He didn't speed. He maintained his car every 3 months, and he went off a bridge with no guardrail at the one point on Highway 7 where the drop is deep enough that they couldn't recover the vehicle for 2 weeks. Ronan felt the words settle into his chest like stones. And in those 2 weeks, Lena continued, Martin filed the emergency custody petition. Dr. Cross submitted her evaluation, and Supervisor Dalton approved expedited processing. She looked at Ronan. 2 weeks. Everything my dad spent months fighting. They finished it in 2 weeks. The kitchen timer was still beeping. Someone finally turned it off, and the silence that replaced it was worse. Your aunt, Ronan said. Your dad's sister. Where is she? Lena's expression changed. Something flickered behind the exhaustion, a tiny flame of hope buried so deep that even she seemed surprised it still existed. Naomi, she lives in Wheeling. She tried to get custody, twice. The court denied her both times. Dr. Cross testified that Naomi was enabling my delusions by believing me. The bitterness in her voice was old, calcified. Believing a kid is a disorder now, apparently. Outside, the storm was worsening. The wind had shifted direction, driving rain against the diner's east-facing windows with a sound like handfuls of gravel thrown against glass. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, and the parking lot lights cast long, distorted shadows across the wet asphalt where the 3 vehicles sat next to Ronan's Harley, the Lexus, the BMW, the county car, all gleaming and expensive, and one rain-soaked motorcycle that looked like it had been through a war, which, in a way, it had. Ronan's phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, a number he recognized. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then answered. Grizzly. The voice on the other end was deep, graveled, the kind of voice that sounded like it had been filtered through decades of cigarette smoke and engine exhaust. It's Deacon. Ronan closed his eyes. Of all the people, of all the nights. How'd you know I was here? Trucker you helped on Route 9. He's a friend of Pike's. Pike called me. Said some lunatic biker spent 40 minutes in the rain fixing his buddy's rig and then rode off into a storm like he was trying to outrun something. I wasn't outrunning anything. You've been outrunning things for 3 years, brother. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. Deacon. Real name, Marcus Wade. President of the Iron Meridian's Black Ridge chapter. The same chapter Ronan had walked away from without explanation, without ceremony, without even handing back his cut. He'd left it folded on the bar of the clubhouse at 4 a.m. with a note that said nothing because there was nothing to say. He'd ridden out before dawn and hadn't looked back. Except he'd been looking back every day since. He just did it where nobody could see. I need something, Ronan said. The words scraped out of his throat like they had hooks in them. Silence on the line. The kind of silence that costs something. The kind that happens when a man who walked away from his brothers picks up the phone for the first time in 3 years and says the one thing he swore he'd never say. Talk to me, Deacon said. Ronan spoke for 4 minutes, quietly. His body angled away from the booth so Lena couldn't hear the details. Not because she couldn't handle them, but because she'd handled enough tonight. He told Deacon about the girl, the recorder, the therapist, the attorney, the CPS supervisor arriving in formation like a military unit executing a retrieval operation, the dead father's voice on the tape, the land, the minerals, the money that made people disappear. When he finished, Deacon was quiet for a long time. You sure about this? I'm sure about the girl. That's not what I asked. I asked if you're sure about this, about calling, about asking. Because 3 years ago you walked out of this family like we were something you could just set down, and now you're picking up the phone because you need us. Deacon's voice wasn't angry. It was something worse. It was honest. You think about what that looks like from this end? Ronan gripped the phone. His knuckles went white. The scar on his forearm pulsed with phantom pain, the kind that shows up when your body remembers what your mind is trying to forget. I know what it looks like. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a man who couldn't sit at our table when things got hard, and now he wants us to ride when things get harder. The words landed, every one of them. Ronan absorbed them the way he'd absorbed shrapnel, with a grunt and a refusal to fall. You're right, he said. I left. I left because every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tommy's face, and Joey's, and Carter's. I saw every brother we buried, and I couldn't sit in that room and pretend I was whole when I was made of pieces that didn't fit together anymore. Deacon said nothing. But this girl, Deacon, she's 13 years old. She's been running for 6 months. Her father is dead, and the people who are supposed to protect her are the people he was running from. She's got a voice recorder full of evidence and a room full of professionals who will destroy it the second she's out of sight. Ronan's voice cracked, just barely. A hairline fracture in the wall he'd spent 3 years building. I can't do this alone. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 15. The rain hammered the diner's roof. The fluorescent lights hummed. Lena sat in the booth behind him, still as a stone, her dead father's recorder sitting on the table like a grenade with the pin pulled. "Where are you?" Deacon said. "Marcy's Diner, Route 9, outside Black Hollow." "I know the place." A pause. The sound of boots on concrete, a door opening, cold wind on the other end of the line. "I'll be there in 90 minutes, and I'm not coming alone." The call ended. Ronan lowered the phone. His hand was shaking, not from cold. He turned back to the booth and found Lena watching him. She hadn't heard the conversation, but she'd read his face. Children who survive dangerous homes learn to read faces the way soldiers learn to read terrain, not for what's visible, but for what's about to change. "You called someone," she said. "Yeah." "Are they coming?" "Yeah." "Are they like you?" Ronan thought about that. About Deacon, who'd spent 22 years in the army before his back gave out, and the VA gave him a prescription instead of a surgery. About Pike, who'd lost his daughter to an overdose and channeled the grief into a motorcycle repair shop that doubled as a halfway house for vets who had nowhere else to go. About the men and women of the Iron Meridian who wore their leather and their scars and their damage like armor, not because they wanted to look dangerous, but because the world had already shown them what danger looked like, and they'd decided to stand between it and the people it was coming for. "They're better than me," he said. Lena studied his face. Then she nodded once, like she'd made a decision about him that she wasn't ready to share. The deputies arrived 12 minutes later. 2 young men in pressed uniforms who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Briggs pulled them aside and spoke in low tones that Ronan couldn't hear, but he could read the body language, the way the deputy's expression shifted from boredom to alertness to something approaching alarm. Briggs returned to the booth. "I'm going to keep the girl here until we sort this out. I've called the district attorney's office. Someone will be here by morning." "Morning's a long time," Ronan said. "It's what I've got." "What about them?" Ronan nodded toward the 3 professionals who had retreated to a booth near the front windows. Cross and Hatch sat close together, speaking in whispers that had the urgent, clipped rhythm of people coordinating their next move. Dalton sat apart from them, staring at her own hands with the hollow expression of someone whose moral architecture had collapsed and left her sitting in the rubble. "They're free to go. I don't have grounds to hold them. They'll destroy evidence." "Maybe. But I can't arrest people on maybe." Ronan leaned forward. "Sheriff, that girl's father is dead. He recorded 43 conversations documenting a conspiracy to steal his daughter's inheritance. The people in that conspiracy are sitting 30 feet from the evidence, and you're telling me they're free to walk out the door and clean house before the sun comes up." Briggs's face hardened, not with anger, with the particular frustration of a man caught between what the law allows and what justice requires. "I know what I'm looking at, Mr. Voss. But I've been a lawman for 27 years, and I've watched more cases collapse because someone moved too fast than because someone moved too slow." He paused. "I'm doing this by the book." The book is what got her into this. The sentence sat between them like a live wire. Briggs stared at Ronan. Ronan stared back. 2 men who understood the same thing from opposite sides of a line that one of them wore on his chest and the other carried in his bones. Briggs turned away. Cross and Hatch stood up. Hatch pulled on his coat with the deliberate calm of a man who had already made 3 phone calls in the last 10 minutes and knew exactly how the next 6 hours would unfold. "Sheriff," Hatch said, "we'll be at the Motor Lodge on Elm, available by phone. Don't leave the county. Wouldn't dream of it." Hatch's smile was thin, professional. The smile of a man who had already calculated every move on a board that other people didn't know they were playing on. They walked out. Cross first, Hatch behind her, their shoes clicking on the wet linoleum in perfect, rehearsed synchronization. Dalton hesitated at the door, looked back at Lena with an expression that might have been guilt, or might have been fear, or might have been the last flicker of conscience in a woman who had sold hers incrementally, one signature at a time, until there was nothing left but the memory of having had one. Then she followed them into the rain. The door swung shut. Ronan watched their headlights pull out of the parking lot, the Lexus first, then the BMW, then the county car. 3 sets of taillights disappearing into the storm like red eyes closing. Lena let out a breath, long, shaking. The kind of breath that a body holds for so long it forgets how to release, and when it finally does, everything that was held in place by the tension starts to shift and settle and ache. "They'll call Martin," she said. "I know. He'll call the judge. Probably. And by morning, there'll be a new court order, an emergency psychiatric hold. They'll say I'm a danger to myself. They'll sedate me and put me in a facility, and the recorder will disappear and no one will ever hear those recordings again." She said it without drama, without tears, with the flat mechanical precision of a child who had watched the system operate from the inside and understood its machinery better than the people who built it. "That's how it works. That's how it always works." Ronan looked at her. At this 13-year-old girl who had spent 6 months running, hiding, surviving on instinct and her dead father's final gift, who had outsmarted a therapist, an attorney, and a county supervisor, who had waited in a roadside diner at 2 a.m. for someone, anyone, who would listen. "Not tonight," he said. The words were simple, quiet, unremarkable. But Lena's chin trembled for the first time since he'd met her, and she pressed her lips together hard enough to turn them white, and she nodded once, and that nod contained more trust than Ronan had been given by another human being in 3 years. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the diner hummed its fluorescent requiem. The 2 truckers had long since left. Darlene refilled Ronan's coffee without being asked, and brought Lena a fresh hot chocolate, warm this time, and retreated behind the counter with the quiet efficiency of a woman who knew when to be present and when to be invisible. The deputies stood by the front door, uncomfortable in the way that young officers are uncomfortable when they can feel something important happening, but can't quite identify what it is. Briggs sat at the counter making calls, his voice too low to follow, and Ronan sat across from a girl who had her dead father's voice in her backpack and the weight of a conspiracy on her shoulders, and he waited. At 3:47 a.m., the first sound of motorcycle engines bled through the storm. Not one engine, not 2. The deep rolling, unmistakable thunder of a dozen Harleys moving in formation through rain and darkness, their headlights cutting through the downpour like the eyes of wolves emerging from a tree line. Lena looked toward the windows. Her body tensed again, the automatic involuntary response of a child who had learned that arrivals meant danger. Ronan touched the table between them. Not her hand. The table. A neutral point. A grounding anchor. "Those are mine," he said. The engines grew louder. The diner's windows vibrated. The coffee in Ronan's mug trembled in concentric circles, and the deputies at the door exchanged a look that was equal parts concern and awe. Through the rain-streaked glass, headlights filled the parking lot. One by one, the bikes pulled in, heavy, road-worn machines ridden by men and women in leather cuts and rain gear, their faces obscured by helmets and weather, their presence filling the gravel lot with the particular authority of people who moved through the world as a unit. The lead bike was a blacked-out road king. The man who dismounted was 6'2", broad-shouldered, with a gray beard and eyes the color of gunmetal. He pulled off his helmet and stood in the rain for a moment, looking at the diner's flickering sign, and then he walked toward the door with the unhurried gait of a man who had been walking toward trouble for decades and had never once considered walking away from it. Deacon stepped inside. Water ran from his leather and pooled on the floor. His eyes found Ronan immediately, across the counter, across the years, across the silence that 3 years of absence had built between them. He didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't speak. He walked to the booth, looked at Lena, looked at Ronan, and then pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat down at the end of the booth like he'd been sitting there his whole life. "All right," he said. His voice filled the room without effort. "Tell me everything." But before Ronan could speak, Deacon's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went cold. The kind of cold that isn't temperature but calculation. The cold of a man processing information that changes the shape of everything in front of him. He looked at Ronan. "Martin Eckhart just filed an emergency petition. Judge Waring signed it 11 minutes ago." Deacon's voice was quiet, controlled. "A scalpel, not a hammer. There's a state transport team en route. They'll be here by dawn." He set the phone on the table. "They're coming to take the girl, and they have the legal authority to do it." Lena's hand closed around the voice recorder. Her knuckles went white, her breathing stopped. And Ronan Voss, a man with no badge, no authority, no legal standing, and a brotherhood he'd abandoned 3 years ago sitting in the rain outside, looked at the girl, looked at the recorder, looked at the man he'd walked away from, and understood with perfect, terrible clarity that every decision he'd made in his life had been leading to this moment. There was no walking away. There was no riding off. There was no version of the next 6 hours where he stayed clean, stayed legal, stayed safe. He had a choice: protect the girl and lose everything, or follow the law and lose her. He looked at Deacon. And Deacon looked back with the eyes of a man who already knew the answer, who had known it before he got on his bike, before he rode 90 minutes through a freezing storm, before he called 11 brothers and sisters to ride with him into a fight that had no legal ground and no clean exit. "What's the play?" Deacon asked. Ronan looked at Lena. She was watching him, waiting. Not with hope, with something older. Something that looked like the last match in a box, held between 2 fingers in a windstorm, waiting to see if this was the hand that would shelter it or let it go out. He picked up the voice recorder. "We don't let them take her," he said, "and we don't let this disappear." Outside, the storm broke open. Thunder rolled across Black Hollow like a war drum, and the engines of 12 motorcycles ticked and cooled in the rain, and somewhere in the darkness, a transport van was already moving toward them with a court order and the full weight of a system that had been built, piece by piece, signature by signature, lie by lie, to silence a dead man's daughter. And the only thing standing between that system and a 13-year-old girl was a broken biker, a brotherhood he'd betrayed, and 43 recordings made by a father who knew he was going to die. Deacon spread a county map across the diner's largest table at 4:11 a.m., while rain hammered the roof like fists on a coffin lid. 12 members of the Iron Meridian stood around him in a loose semicircle, dripping water onto the linoleum, their leather cuts dark with rain, their faces carved from the particular stone that forms when exhaustion meets purpose. They smelled like wet road and engine oil and cold tobacco. They filled the diner the way soldiers fill a forward operating base, not with noise, but with presence. The kind of presence that changes the weight of a room. Ronan stood at the edge of the group, not inside it. 3 years of absence had placed him there, and no one pretended otherwise. He could feel the distance like a physical thing, a gap of 2 feet that might as well have been a canyon. The brothers and sisters he'd walked away from stood shoulder to shoulder with each other and left a space around him that was shaped exactly like the trust he'd broken. Pike was there. 6'1", rail-thin, a face like a hatchet blade with pale blue eyes that never quite focused on the present tense. He'd lost his daughter, Ruby, 4 years ago, 19 years old, found in a motel bathroom with the needle still in her arm, and a system that had failed her at every checkpoint between childhood and death. Pike hadn't spoken to Ronan since the night he left. He didn't speak to him now. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and his eyes on the map like the geography was the only thing in the room worth his attention. Beside Pike stood Cora Switchback Dunn, 43, former Army medic, built like a truck axle and twice as hard to break. She had a scar that ran from her left ear to the corner of her mouth, a souvenir from a bar fight in Kandahar that she'd won. She was the Iron Meridian Sergeant at Arms, which meant she was responsible for discipline, security, and the particular kind of violence that happened when diplomacy failed. She looked at Ronan once when he joined the table. One look. It contained 3 years of anger compressed into a single second of eye contact, and then she turned away like he was furniture. "Transport team," Deacon said, tapping the map. coming from the state psychiatric facility in Graydon. That's 62 miles east on Route 9. In this weather, they're doing maybe 40, 45. That gives us roughly 70 minutes before they roll into this parking lot with a court order and a set of restraints. Restraints? Cora's voice was flat, surgical. Standard procedure for involuntary psychiatric transport of a minor deemed a danger to herself. Deacon paused. That's what the order says. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes things breaking. She's 13, Pike said. First words he'd spoken since walking through the door. His voice sounded like it had been dragged across gravel. I know how old she is. They're going to put restraints on a 13-year-old girl. That's what the court order authorizes, yes. Pike uncrossed his arms. His hands hung at his sides, and the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables under skin. Ronan recognized the posture. It was the posture of a man whose body was preparing for something his mind hadn't agreed to yet. Ronan looked toward the booth where Lena sat. She was curled against the wall with her backpack clutched to her chest, the voice recorder inside it. Darlene had given her a blanket from somewhere, threadbare, smelling of coffee and storage closets, and the girl had wrapped it around her shoulders like armor made of cloth. She wasn't sleeping. Her eyes were open, tracking every movement in the diner with the relentless vigilance of someone who had learned that closing your eyes was a luxury she couldn't afford. Sheriff Briggs stood by the counter, phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of controlled frustration. He'd been on calls for the last 30 minutes, to the district attorney, to the county clerk, to someone Ronan couldn't identify. Each call ended the same way. Briggs pulling the phone from his ear, staring at it, and dialing again. Whatever answers he was getting weren't the ones he needed. Legal options, Deacon said. Not a question. A demand. A woman at the end of the table spoke. Ronan hadn't met her before. Mid-30s, sharp features, no cut, wearing a rain jacket over a collared shirt. She looked like she'd been pulled out of an office rather than a bed. Joanna Serrano, she said, not looking at Ronan. I'm the Meridian's counsel. Deacon called me an hour ago. She set a tablet on the table and spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone billing by the minute. The emergency psychiatric hold was signed by Judge Harrison Waring, family court. He's the same judge who approved the original guardianship petition 6 months ago. I pulled his campaign finance records on the drive here. She turned the tablet to face the group. Martin Eckhart, or Martin Dressler, his real name, donated $42,000 to Waring's re-election campaign over the last 3 years, through 4 different shell companies, all registered in Delaware. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The rain intensified against the windows, and the information settled over the table like a second storm. So the judge is bought, Cora said. The judge has a financial relationship with the petitioner that he failed to disclose. Whether that constitutes corruption is for a grand jury to decide. What it means right now, tonight, is that the court order is legally valid until someone with standing challenges it. And who has standing? Deacon asked. A family member. A guardian ad litem. An attorney representing the child's interests. Joanna looked at the booth where Lena sat. Does the girl have any family? An aunt, Ronan said. Her father's sister, Naomi Mercer, lives in Wheeling. Has she been notified? I don't have her number. I do. Lena's voice came from the booth, quiet but clear. Everyone turned. She was sitting upright now, the blanket pulled around her waist, her eyes fixed on the group of bikers who had ridden through a storm to stand in a diner at 4 a.m. for a girl they'd never met. Naomi's number is in my dad's recorder. He left it for me, along with the name of a federal investigator he contacted 2 weeks before he died. The room went still. Federal? Joanna leaned forward. My dad didn't just record conversations, Lena said. Her voice was steady, too steady. The steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this information alone in dark rooms until it became muscle memory. He researched everything. Martin's real name, the shell companies, the land surveys, the mineral rights. He contacted someone at the FBI field office in Pittsburgh and gave them a preliminary report. She paused. They opened a file, and then nothing happened. Nothing happened, Deacon repeated. My dad called them 4 more times, left messages, sent documents. The last time he called, they told him the case had been referred to local authorities for review. Her jaw tightened. Local authorities? The same county where Judge Waring sits, the same county where Supervisor Dalton works. The implication landed like a hammer on glass. Pike stepped away from the table and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room, staring out at the rain-battered parking lot, his reflection ghosting across the dark glass. His fists were clenched at his sides. His breathing was visible in the cold air leaking through the window frame. "Pike," Deacon's voice carried a warning. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. And I need you here, not in your head." Pike turned from the window. His eyes were wet, not with tears, with the particular moisture that comes from holding too much inside for too long and feeling it press against the back of your eyes like water behind a dam. "Ruby called CPS twice," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Twice. Before the foster system ground her into dust. They opened a file, and then nothing happened." He looked at Lena. Same words, same system, same nothing. The connection between a dead girl in a motel bathroom and a living girl in a diner booth stretched across the room like a wire pulled tight enough to sing. Ronan watched Pike's face and understood something he hadn't understood 3 years ago. The reason Pike drank, the reason Pike raged, the reason Pike once put his fist through the clubhouse wall and sat on the floor bleeding into the sawdust while everyone pretended they hadn't seen it. It wasn't grief. Grief was the surface. Underneath was something worse. The knowledge that the system had watched his daughter die in slow motion and documented every stage of the process with filed reports and closed cases and the bureaucratic efficiency of an institution that had confused paperwork with protection. "Joanna," Deacon said, "what happens if we physically prevent the transport team from taking the girl? You go to jail, all of you. Obstruction, interference with a court order, possible kidnapping charges, depending on how the prosecutor wants to frame it." She paused. "And they still take the girl. What if we move her before they arrive?" "Same charges, plus flight from legal custody. And it gives Eckhart's attorneys ammunition to argue that Lena is being manipulated by outside actors, specifically an outlaw motorcycle club with no legal relationship to the child." Cora slammed her palm on the table. The map jumped. Coffee cups rattled. The deputies by the door straightened. "So we do nothing. We stand here and watch them put restraints on a child because some bought judge signed a piece of paper?" "I didn't say we do nothing. I said we can't do it with muscle." Joanna's voice didn't waver. She looked at Cora with the calm authority of someone who had learned to stand her ground against people twice her size because the law was heavier than any fist. "We do it with evidence. Those recordings are the only leverage we have. If we can get them to someone with jurisdiction before the transport team arrives, someone outside this county's chain of command, we can file for an emergency stay." "Who?" Deacon asked. "Federal. The same FBI field office David Mercer contacted. But we need a name, a specific agent, someone who won't route it back through the same channels that buried it the first time." Every head turned to Lena. She reached into her backpack. Her fingers moved inside the lining, the hidden compartment her father had taught her to create, and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellow with age, soft at the creases from being opened and refolded dozens of times. She unfolded it on the table. A name, a phone number, a handwritten note in cramped, urgent script. "Special Agent Dana Whitford," Lena read. "My dad wrote this next to her name." She held up the paper. The handwriting was shaky but legible. She listened. She's the only one who listened. Joanna took the paper, pulled out her phone, looked at Deacon. "It's 4:30 in the morning. Call her," Joanna dialed. The phone rang and rang and rang, and then someone answered. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Joanna walked to the far end of the diner, speaking in the low, precise language of attorneys who understand that every word they say at 4 in the morning might end up in a court transcript. Ronan couldn't hear the details, but he watched her face, watched the shift from professional composure to something more urgent, the tightening of her jaw, the way her free hand gripped the back of a chair, the single moment when she closed her eyes and pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose like someone absorbing information that was worse than she'd expected. When she returned to the table, her face was different. Agent Whitford remembers David Mercer's case, she said. She remembers it because she was told to close it, directly, by her supervising agent, 6 months ago, 2 weeks before David Mercer died. The words detonated in the silence. She was told to close it, Deacon said slowly. She was told the matter had been resolved through local channels and the file was no longer a federal priority. She pushed back. She was reassigned to another division. The file was transferred to an agent named Craig Bowen, who, according to Whitford, has a consulting relationship with a lobbying firm that represents mineral extraction companies in the region. Ronan felt the floor shift beneath him. Not physically, something deeper. The sick gravitational lurch of understanding that the conspiracy wasn't local. It wasn't a crooked judge and a bot therapist and a corrupt CPS supervisor. It was layered. It had infrastructure. It had reach into federal law enforcement. A 13-year-old girl sitting in a roadside diner was holding evidence against a machine that extended farther than anyone in this room had imagined. Pike spoke from the window. How big is this? Joanna set her phone down. Big enough that someone at the federal level intervened to protect it. Big enough that a father who tried to expose it is dead. Big enough that the only copy of the evidence is sitting in a child's backpack in a diner that's about to be visited by a state transport team with the legal authority to take her and everything she's carrying. The fluorescent lights hummed, the rain hammered, and 12 members of the Iron Meridian stood around a table and stared at a map of a county that had suddenly become the perimeter of something much larger than a custody dispute. Deacon looked at Ronan. The look lasted 3 seconds, but it contained a conversation that would have taken an hour to have out loud. It contained 3 years of silence, 3 years of anger, 3 years of a brotherhood that had been wounded by the departure of a man who couldn't explain why he left because the explanation lived in a part of him he'd sealed shut. You brought us into this, Deacon said. I did. You understand what happens if we go sideways? We're not a law firm. We're not a federal agency. We're a motorcycle club with a reputation that every prosecutor in this state would love to use against us. Deacon's voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent decades balancing the weight of leadership against the demands of loyalty. If this goes wrong, it's not just us. It's every chapter, every brother, every family connected to the Iron Meridian. I know. Do you? Because 3 years ago you decided you couldn't carry the weight anymore. You put it down. And we picked it up. Every piece you dropped, Grizzly, we carried it. Pike carried it. Cora carried it. I carried it. The words came out without heat, which made them worse. Heat could be argued with. This was just truth, spoken flat, laid on the table like the map. So before I commit this club to a fight that could end us, I need to know something. Ask? Are you here? Not for tonight. Not until the sun comes up. Are you here? Ronan felt the question settle into his chest and press against the thing he'd been protecting for 3 years. The sealed room, the locked door, the place where he kept the faces of the brothers who died, and the guilt of being alive and the shame of not being enough. He looked at Pike, at the man who'd buried his daughter and still rode through a freezing storm because a stranger's child needed protection. He looked at Cora, at the scar on her face that she wore like a statement, not of what had been done to her, but of what she'd survived. He looked at the 11 other men and women standing in a diner at 4:30 in the morning, soaking wet, road-worn, exhausted, and not one of them asking why they were here because they already knew. And then he looked at Lena, at a 13-year-old girl who had watched her father die, survived 6 months of institutional abuse, run through a freezing night with evidence sewn into her backpack, and whispered the truth to a stranger because she had no one else to whisper it to. I'm here, he said, and I'm not leaving again. Deacon studied his face for a long time, reading it the way old soldiers read terrain, not for what was visible, but for what was hidden in the shadows and the low ground and the places where ambushes waited. Then he nodded. Once. All right. He turned to the table. Joanna, what does Whitford need? She needs the recordings digitized and transmitted to her personal server, not the FBI's system, her personal secure server. She's going to take them directly to the Inspector General's office, bypassing her chain of command entirely. Can we digitize them here? We need a computer with audio input and a stable internet connection. Everyone looked at Darlene, who had been standing behind the counter through the entire conversation with the expression of a woman who had lived in Black Hollow long enough to know that the rot ran deeper than anyone admitted, but had never expected to see someone actually try to cut it out. "There's a laptop in the office," she said. "Internet's slow, but it works." "We need time," Joanna said. 43 recordings, even compressed. That's going to take, how long? 2 hours minimum. Deacon checked his watch. Transport team arrives in 50 minutes. The math was brutal. They needed 2 hours. They had 50 minutes. And when the transport team arrived with a court order, there would be nothing legal standing between them and Lena except a sheriff who was running out of jurisdiction and a motorcycle club that was running out of options. "We stall," Cora said. "How?" "Briggs." Cora looked at the sheriff, who had ended his latest phone call and was walking back toward the group with the heavy steps of a man who'd been told things he didn't want to hear. "Sheriff, what did the DA say?" Briggs looked tired, the kind of tired that goes deeper than sleep, the kind that accumulates over decades of doing a job that asks you to enforce laws that don't always protect the people they're supposed to protect. "DA's office says the court order is valid. I'm obligated to facilitate the transport." "And if you don't?" "I'm removed from duty. County sends state police to execute the order." He paused. "That's the official answer." "And the unofficial?" Briggs looked at Lena, looked at the recorder, looked at the group of bikers who had materialized in his county at 4 a.m. like a storm within a storm. "Unofficial answer is, I've been doing this for 27 years, and I've never seen a custody case that smelled this bad. But smelling bad isn't grounds for defying a court order. I need something concrete." "What about Dalton's notes?" Ronan said. "The ones dated before the guardianship hearing." Briggs pulled the manila folder from the counter. "Irregular, but not necessarily illegal. A CPS supervisor can open a preliminary file based on what? A report that nobody filed? A call that nobody made?" Ronan's voice was rising. He caught it, pulled it back, forced it level. "Sheriff, those notes prove that the investigation was manufactured before there was a reason to investigate. Dalton was building a case against a child before the child's father was even dead." The sentence landed on Briggs like a physical weight. His shoulders dropped an inch. His hand moved to his face and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his palms, the gesture of a man scrubbing away the last layer of deniability. "Even if that's true, I can't overrule a sitting judge on my own authority." "You can delay," Joanna said. "You have discretion over how transport is facilitated. Safety concerns, weather conditions, staffing issues. You can buy us time without defying the order." "How much time?" 2 hours. Briggs stared at her. "You want me to delay a state-ordered psychiatric transport for 2 hours, based on the word of a motorcycle club's attorney and a voice recorder that hasn't been authenticated. Based on a dead father's recordings, a child who is terrified of the people who are supposed to protect her, and CPS documentation that was fabricated months before the triggering event." Joanna held his gaze. 27 years, Sheriff. You said you've never seen a case that smelled this bad. Trust your nose." Briggs looked at the floor, looked at the ceiling, looked at everything in the room that wasn't a human face, because human faces were asking him to do something that could end his career, and he needed to find the answer somewhere that wasn't looking back at him with expectation. "I'll give you 90 minutes, he said. "I'll cite weather conditions and road safety concerns for the transport delay. That's the maximum I can justify without someone going over my head." "Thank you, Sheriff." "Don't thank me. If this blows up, I'm the one holding the bag." He turned to the deputies. "Nobody leaves this diner. Nobody enters without my authorization." The deputies nodded, nervous, young, standing at the edge of something they could feel but couldn't name. Joanna moved fast. She took the laptop from Darlene's office, a machine so old it wheezed on startup, and set it up on the counter. Lena brought the recorder, 43 recordings. Each one a fragment of a dead man's desperation, stored on a device held together with electrical tape and a daughter's refusal to let her father's truth die with him. The first recording played through the laptop speakers while Joanna worked on the file transfer. David Mercer's voice filled the diner again, quiet, shaking, methodical. He documented dates, names, dollar amounts, shell companies, property transfers. He described meetings he'd secretly attended, phone conversations he'd overheard, documents he'd photographed through windows. Recording 7 stopped Ronan cold. David Mercer's voice changed. The methodical tone fractured. What replaced it was raw animal fear. "They know. Martin knows I've been recording. He told Claire," a shaking breath. "He told my ex-wife that if I don't stop, they'll have Lena committed permanently. Not the temporary hold. Permanent. He said he has a facility lined up in another state. A private facility. The kind that doesn't answer to oversight boards. The kind where children go in and don't come out the same." The diner went silent. He said it in front of Claire. He said it like he was ordering dinner, and she didn't say a word. My ex-wife sat there and listened to a man describe putting our daughter in a cage, and she didn't say a single word. Pike walked out of the diner. The door slammed behind him. Through the rain-streaked window, Ronan watched him stand in the parking lot with his face turned up to the storm, rain pouring over him, his fists clenched at his sides, his body vibrating with a rage that had no outlet, because the thing he was raging against wasn't a person. It was a system, and you can't hit a system hard enough to make it stop. Cora went after him, stood beside him in the rain, didn't touch him, didn't speak. Just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, the way brothers and sisters stand when there's nothing to say and everything to feel, and the only thing that helps is knowing you're not standing alone. Recording 19 made Joanna stop typing. David Mercer's voice was almost unrecognizable, hoarse, broken, the voice of a man who had been crying for hours and couldn't stop. "I found the facility. It's called Graydon Pines, private. It's where the transport team is coming from tonight. Martin has a financial stake in it. He owns 12% through a holding company." The recording crackled. "They don't just warehouse children there. They use them. Medical trials, pharmaceutical testing, off-label drug protocols on minors who have been declared incompetent by the courts. Kids with no advocates. Kids with no one looking for them." Ronan turned to look at Lena. She was sitting on the counter stool, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around her shins. She was listening to her father's voice describe the place they were planning to send her, and she wasn't crying. She was memorizing, storing every word in the same part of her mind that had kept her alive for 6 months, the part that didn't feel, didn't flinch, didn't break, because breaking was a luxury that endangered children can't afford. But her hands were shaking. She couldn't hide that. Her small hands, wrapped around her knees, trembled with a frequency that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the particular vibration of a human being holding themselves together through sheer, desperate will. Ronan walked to her, sat on the stool beside her, didn't touch her, didn't speak, just sat. The way Cora stood beside Pike in the rain, the way you stay close to someone who is surviving something that no child should have to survive. Lena looked at him. Her eyes were dry, fierce, ancient in a way that no 13-year-old's eyes should be. "He knew," she said. "He knew they were going to kill him, and he still kept recording." "Yeah. Because he thought someone would listen." "Someone did." Ronan paused. "You found me." "I didn't find you." Her voice cracked for the first time, just a hairline fracture. "I found a diner. You were just there. Sometimes that's how it works." She looked at her hands, at the trembling she couldn't control, and then she looked back at him with an expression that contained everything a 13-year-old girl carries when the world has taken her father, corrupted her mother, weaponized the institutions that were supposed to protect her, and left her sitting in a roadside diner with a backpack full of evidence and a room full of strangers who were the closest thing to safety she'd known in 6 months. "Are they going to take me?" Ronan looked at the clock on the diner wall. 5:02 a.m. Joanna was uploading recordings as fast as the ancient internet connection would allow. Briggs was on his radio again, stalling with weather reports and road condition updates. The Iron Meridians stood guard inside and outside the diner, their presence a physical barrier that no court order could dissolve but no court would respect. 40 minutes until the transport team arrived. 17 recordings still to upload. "No," Ronan said. He said it the way you say something that you will make true, even if the truth has to be built from wreckage, even if it costs you everything you have left, even if the only tools available are your body and your stubbornness, and a brotherhood you don't deserve standing in the rain behind you. "No, they are not going to take you." Then Deacon's phone rang. He answered, listened. His face didn't change. His body didn't move. But something behind his eyes, something structural, something load-bearing, shifted, like a beam cracking inside a wall that's still standing but won't be for long. He lowered the phone and looked at Ronan. That was Joanna's contact at the county clerk's office. She pulled the transport order details. He paused. The kind of pause that happens before a sentence that changes everything. The transport team isn't coming from Graydon Pines. Where are they coming from? They're already here. They've been here. Checked into the motor lodge on Elm Street 3 hours before the emergency petition was even filed. The information detonated. 3 hours before. The transport team was in Black Hollow before the court order existed, before Hatch called Judge Waring, before anyone officially knew where Lena was. They had been pre-positioned, staged, waiting for a signal. This wasn't a response to a runaway child. This was an extraction, planned, coordinated, executed with the precision of people who had done this before. Not once, not twice, but enough times to have a protocol, a checklist. A team that traveled to small towns and waited in motor lodges for judges to sign orders that had been drafted before the ink on the petition was dry. How many times, Ronan said. His voice was barely audible. How many times have they done this? Deacon stared at him, and for the first time since Ronan had known him, through 20 years of friendship, through combat deployments, through funerals, through the kind of darkness that bonds men in ways that daylight never understands, Deacon looked afraid. Not of the danger, of the scope. Lena, Deacon said. He turned to the girl. Your father's recordings. Did he mention other children? Lena's face changed. Something passed across it, a shadow, a flicker, the micro-expression of a child who has been carrying a secret so heavy that even acknowledging its existence feels like it might crush her. Recording 37, she whispered. Joanna scrolled. Found it. Pressed play. David Mercer's voice, barely a whisper now, the voice of a man recording in total darkness, in total fear, in the final days of a life he knew was ending. It's not just Lena. There are others. I found records. Hidden records. Graydon Pines has processed 47 minors in the last 5 years through fraudulent guardianship transfers. 47 children declared incompetent by courts with financial ties to the facility's investors. 47 children who disappeared into a system designed to... The recording cut off. Static. Silence. Then David Mercer's voice, one last time, trembling with a fury that was indistinguishable from grief. My daughter will not be number 48. The diner existed in absolute silence for 5 seconds. 10. The fluorescent lights hummed their dead, indifferent drone. The rain fell. The clock on the wall ticked toward 5:14 a.m., and then headlights appeared on Route 9. Not from the east, where the storm was dying. From the west, from Elm Street. From the motor lodge where the transport team had been waiting, 3 hours before the court order, 3 hours before the phone calls, 3 hours before a bought judge signed a piece of paper authorizing the removal of a child from the only people who had ever bothered to listen to her. A white van. Unmarked. Followed by a black sedan, moving slowly through the rain toward Marcy's diner. Deacon looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Lena. Lena looked at the approaching headlights with the exhausted, unsurprised expression of someone who had been running from this moment for 6 months and had always known it would catch her. 17 recordings left, Joanna said from behind the laptop. Her voice was steady, but her hands were moving faster. I need 20 more minutes. 20 minutes they didn't have. The van's headlights grew brighter, closer. The engine sound was barely audible beneath the rain, but Ronan could feel it. A low, mechanical hum that vibrated through the diner's foundation like a heartbeat approaching from the wrong direction. Briggs stood up from the counter, his hand moved to his holster. Not drawing, resting. The gesture of a man who hoped he wouldn't need what was there but was no longer certain. Everyone stay calm, he said. Ronan looked at Lena one more time. Her hands had stopped shaking. That was worse. That meant she'd moved past fear into something beyond it. The cold, clear place where children go when they've exhausted every emotion, and the only thing left is the question of whether the adults around them will be different this time, or whether the world will do what the world has always done. He stood up from the stool, walked to the front door, stood beside Deacon, shoulder to shoulder, The 2-foot gap between them finally closed, not by forgiveness, not by reconciliation, but by the simple, irreducible fact that a child was in danger and the distance between them was a luxury neither of them could afford anymore. The van pulled into the parking lot, and Ronan Voss understood, with the clarity of a man who has spent his entire life preparing for a moment he never wanted to face, that everything he'd done, every mile ridden, every brother buried, every night spent alone with the engine running and the road disappearing beneath him, had been leading here. To this diner, to this girl, to this door. He reached for the handle. The door opened and the cold came in like a living thing. Ronan stood in the frame with Deacon at his shoulder, and the rain hit them both sideways, driving, horizontal, needles of ice water that found every gap in leather and fabric and skin. The parking lot of Marcy's diner was a shallow lake now, 3 inches of standing water reflecting the diner's dying neon and the headlights of the white van that had stopped 40 feet from the entrance with its engine still running. The van's doors didn't open immediately. That was the first thing Ronan noticed. In a legitimate transport, the team exits the vehicle, identifies themselves, presents credentials. Protocol. Procedure. The choreography of institutional authority performing itself for witnesses. These people sat in the van with the engine running and the headlights pinning the diner's front door like a spotlight on a stage. They were waiting. Ronan looked at the black sedan parked behind the van. Through the rain-blurred windshield, he could see a figure in the passenger seat, phone pressed to an ear, talking, receiving instructions. The silhouette of someone who wasn't in charge but was connected to whoever was. "They're coordinating," Deacon said beside him, low, barely louder than the rain. "With who?" "That's the question." Behind them, inside the diner, Joanna's fingers moved across the laptop keyboard with the controlled urgency of a surgeon racing a bleed. 17 recordings, 20 minutes. The internet connection in Black Hollow was barely functional on a good day, and tonight the storm had reduced it to something that wheezed and stalled and dropped packets like a dying pulse. 14 recordings uploaded. 3 remaining. Lena sat on the counter stool with her knees drawn up, watching the van through the window with the same expression she'd had when the 3 professionals walked in hours ago. Not surprise. Not fear. Recognition. The face of someone seeing a machine she'd watched operate before. Seeing the next gear engage, the next mechanism fire, the next phase of a process designed to consume her. The van's driver's side door opened. A man stepped out into the rain. Tall, lean, military short hair gone silver at the temples. He wore a dark jacket with no visible insignia and carried a clipboard, the universal prop of bureaucratic authority. His movements were precise, efficient, practiced. Not a medical professional's movements, not a social worker's. The movements of someone who had done extractions before and understood them as logistics problems, not human ones. Behind him, 2 more figures emerged from the van's side door. A man and a woman, both wearing medical scrubs beneath rain jackets. The woman carried a medical bag. The man carried nothing, but his hands stayed loose at his sides in the particular way that people carry their hands when they're trained to restrain. 3 people. A van, a court order, and a child. Sheriff Briggs pushed past Ronan and Deacon and stepped into the rain. His badge caught the neon light and threw it back in fragments. His hand rested on his belt, and his voice carried the exhausted authority of a man who had been awake for too long and had used up his patience 3 hours ago. "I'm Sheriff Dan Briggs. I need credentials from everyone before anyone sets foot inside this building." The silver-haired man stopped, produced a laminated ID card from his jacket pocket, and held it out without expression. "Carl Jessup, Director of Patient Transport, Graydon Pines Residential Treatment Center. We're here pursuant to an emergency psychiatric transport order signed by Judge Harrison Waring." He produced the folded document. "The minor, Lena Mercer, is to be transported to our facility for immediate evaluation and stabilization." Briggs took the ID. Examined it, examined the court order. His flashlight moved across the paper, and Ronan watched the sheriff's eyes, watched them read, then reread, then narrow at something on the page that didn't sit right. "This order was issued at 3:48 a.m., Briggs said. "That's correct." "And you're telling me you assembled a transport team, drove from Graydon, which is 62 miles east, and arrived here in... Briggs checked his watch. Less than 90 minutes, in this weather. Jessup didn't blink. We were already in the area. Dr. Cross contacted our facility earlier in the evening regarding a potential emergency transport. We pre-positioned as a precaution. Pre-positioned. Briggs said the word like he was tasting something rotten. Standard procedure for high-risk cases involving... You were at the Motor Lodge on Elm. You checked in at midnight, 3 hours before this order was signed. Briggs folded the court order and held it at his side. That's not a precaution, Mr. Jessup. That's a plan. For the first time, something flickered behind Jessup's composure. Not concern. Recalibration. The micro-adjustment of a man who has encountered an obstacle in what was supposed to be a smooth operation. Sheriff, I understand your concerns, but the order is legally binding, and any delay in executing it puts the minor at risk. Dr. Cross's evaluation indicates Dr. Cross isn't here. Dr. Cross left this diner 2 hours ago with an attorney who has financial ties to the minor's stepfather and a CPS supervisor whose documentation predates the case she was supposedly investigating. Briggs stepped closer, close enough that the rain falling between them was the only thing separating their faces. So what I have right now is a court order signed by a judge with undisclosed financial ties to the petitioner, a transport team that was in place before the order existed, and a child inside that diner who is more afraid of the people claiming to protect her than she is of a room full of bikers she's never met. The parking lot was silent except for the rain. The two figures behind Jessup exchanged a glance. The man in scrubs shifted his weight. The woman's hand tightened on her medical bag, and from behind the black sedan a fourth figure emerged. Not from the vehicle, from behind it, as if he'd been standing in the darkness, watching, waiting to see how the first act played out before deciding to appear. Martin Eckhart stepped into the headlights. He was shorter than Ronan had imagined. 5'10", lean, expensive overcoat, polished shoes now ankle-deep in parking lot water. His face was the kind of face that belonged in boardrooms and campaign photos. Symmetrical, confident, designed to project trustworthiness the way a storefront is designed to project value. His hair was immaculate despite the rain. His smile arrived 3 seconds after his face, like it had been shipped from a warehouse. Sheriff Briggs. His voice was smooth, practiced. The voice of a man who had spent decades learning how to say reasonable things in reasonable tones while doing unreasonable things behind closed doors. I'm Martin Eckhart, Lena's stepfather. I've been worried sick. Ronan's hands curled into fists at his sides. Not from anger, from recognition. He'd met men like this before, in combat zones, in corporate offices, in courtrooms, men whose cruelty was so thoroughly upholstered in civility that you couldn't see the machinery until it was already grinding. Mr. Eckhart, I'm going to need you to stay back. Sheriff, I have every legal right to be here. Lena is my stepdaughter. I have court-ordered custody. I have a transport team authorized by a sitting judge. Eckhart spread his hands, a gesture of openness that contained exactly nothing. I want what everyone here wants. I want Lena safe. Inside the diner, Ronan heard a sound. Small, almost inaudible. Lena's stool scraping backward on the floor. He turned. Through the glass door, he could see her. She'd stood up from the counter and backed against the far wall, beside the jukebox that hadn't worked in decades. Her body had gone rigid, not with the practiced alertness she'd shown all night, but with something raw, something animal. The response of a child who has just seen the face of the person who has been hunting her walk out of the darkness wearing a smile. Deacon, Ronan said without turning around. I see her. Don't let anyone pass this door. Ronan walked back inside, crossed the diner in 4 strides, crouched in front of Lena, not too close, not blocking her path, leaving the space she needed to feel like she wasn't cornered. Look at me, he said. Her eyes were fixed on the window, on the parking lot, on Martin Eckhart's silhouette standing in the headlights like something that had crawled out of a nightmare and put on an overcoat. Lena, look at me. She looked at him. Her pupils were dilated. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, the hyperventilation that precedes either panic or shutdown, the body's last debate before it chooses fight or collapse. He's here, she said. I know. He'll take me. He always takes me. He always wins because he's... Her voice fractured. The carefully maintained composure she'd held for hours. The armor of calm she'd built around herself like a child's fortress made of pillows and silence, cracked open, and behind it was a 13-year-old girl who was terrified. He always wins. Ronan held her gaze. He kept his voice low, steady, not calm. Steadiness was different from calm. Calm was the absence of storm. Steadiness was the ability to stand inside one. Not tonight. You don't know him. You don't know what he does. He makes people believe him. He makes everyone believe him. My mom believed him. The judge believes him. The FBI believed him. Her voice was rising, shaking, words tumbling out in the desperate rush of someone who has been silent for so long that speaking feels like a dam breaking. He'll stand out there and smile and say reasonable things, and everyone will nod and everyone will agree, and they'll put me in that van and I will never come out. Lena. You can't stop him. You can't. He's too... Lena. Ronan reached out slowly, extended his hand, palm up, on the table beside the dead jukebox. Not touching her, not grabbing, just offering. A hand, open, scarred, calloused, shaking slightly with the effort of holding still when every nerve in his body was screaming at him to walk back outside and put Martin Eckhart through the wall of his own van. She stared at his hand, at the scar across the knuckles, at the tremor he couldn't hide. You're shaking, she said. Yeah. Why? Because I'm scared too. The honesty broke something open between them. Not a wall, a pretense. The pretense that adults aren't afraid. The pretense that strength means the absence of fear. The pretense that the people who protect you do it without cost. Lena placed her hand in his. Her fingers were small and cold, and they wrapped around two of his fingers the way a child grabs a railing on a staircase in the dark. Not for warmth, but for proof that something solid exists in a world that has gone liquid around her. 3 more recordings, Joanna said from behind the laptop. Her voice was tight, controlled. The voice of a woman who understood that the next 10 minutes would determine whether 43 recordings reached someone who could use them or disappeared into the same void that had swallowed David Mercer's life. 7 minutes. Outside, the confrontation had escalated. Ronan could hear it through the walls. Briggs's voice, harder now. Eckhart's voice, smoother. The attorney's voice. Hatch had materialized from somewhere, probably the motor lodge, arriving in a separate vehicle. His courtroom authority now deployed in a parking lot at 5:30 in the morning. And Deacon's voice, low and steady, the bass note beneath the chaos saying very little but occupying space in a way that made everyone conscious of how much space he occupied. Sheriff, I'm going to give you one more opportunity to comply with this order before I contact the State Attorney General's office. That was Hatch. His voice carried through the rain and the glass with the confidence of a man who had already dialed the number and was holding it as leverage. You do what you need to do, counselor, but until I've completed my assessment of the safety conditions for transport, that child stays inside. Safety conditions? What safety conditions? Those. Briggs pointed at the 12 motorcycles in the parking lot. I've got a dozen unidentified individuals on scene. I need to verify identities, run checks, ensure the transport environment is secure. That's a stall tactic and you know it. Call it what you want. I call it procedure. Deacon stood between the diner door and the transport team like a wall that happened to breathe. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken except when spoken to. But his presence, the sheer physical fact of him, 6'2", broad, leather-clad, standing in the rain like it was an inconvenience rather than an assault, created a geometry in the parking lot that the transport team had to navigate around. Pike stood to Deacon's left, Cora to his right. The rest of the Meridian arranged themselves in a loose arc between the diner entrance and the van, not blocking, not confronting, just present. 12 leather-clad figures standing in a freezing rainstorm because a girl they'd never met needed them standing there. Eckhart watched them with the calculating expression of a man assessing obstacles. His smile hadn't faltered. It was the kind of smile that was load-bearing, structural, part of the architecture of his entire persona. Remove it, and the facade would collapse. Sheriff, Eckhart said, and his voice dropped to the confiding register that reasonable men use when they want to isolate someone from the crowd. I understand how this looks. A stepfather shows up with a transport team. I know the optics aren't great, but Lena is sick. She's genuinely ill. Her father's death traumatized her, and the grief has manifested in paranoid delusions. She believes people are conspiring against her. It's textbook. Dr. Cross can explain it far better than I can. Dr. Cross isn't here. She's available by phone. I don't want her by phone. I wanted her here. She chose to leave. Because she was being intimidated by... Eckhart gestured toward the bikers. By these people. Nobody intimidated anyone. I was present for the entire interaction. Sheriff! Eckhart's voice hardened by 1 degree. Just one. Enough to signal that the velvet was coming off the hammer. I've been patient. I've been cooperative. But my stepdaughter is inside that building in the company of a motorcycle gang. Club, Deacon said. Eckhart turned. Excuse me? It's a club, not a gang. Words matter, Mr. Eckhart. You should know that. You changed your name to make sure of it. The parking lot went silent. Rain hammered the asphalt. The van's engine idled. The neon sign buzzed its broken syllable into the dark. Eckhart's smile remained, but his eyes changed. The warmth drained out of them like water out of a cracked glass, and what remained was something Ronan recognized from his years in war zones. The flat, reptilian assessment of a predator evaluating whether a threat is worth engaging or circumventing. I don't know what you're referring to, Eckhart said. Martin Dressler, Deacon said. Property acquisition firm in the Midwest, shut down for fraud. 4 shell companies in Delaware funneling donations to Judge Waring's re-election campaign. 12% ownership stake in Graydon Pines through a holding company. Deacon recited the facts the way a soldier recites coordinates, flat, precise, emotionless. You want me to keep going, or do you want to stop pretending? Eckhart's smile finally died. What replaced it was worse. A blank? A void. The empty expression of a man who has worn masks for so long that the face beneath them has atrophied into nothing. No emotion, no guilt, no humanity. Just calculation. Just the frictionless machinery of a person who views other human beings as obstacles or assets and has never encountered a category in between. You have no idea what you're involved in, Eckhart said. His voice was different now, stripped. The reasonable tone gone, the confiding warmth gone, replaced by something flat and cold and truthful. You think this is about one girl? One piece of land? You think I'm some small-town grifter running a custody scam? I think you're a man who profits from putting children in cages, Deacon said. Eckhart laughed, a single sharp exhalation that had nothing to do with humor. I'm a small piece of something you can't even see the edges of. And every minute you stand in this parking lot playing vigilante, you're putting yourselves and that girl in more danger than you can imagine. That a threat? It's geography. You're standing at the bottom of a mountain, looking up, and you think you can see the top. He glanced at the diner, at the window where Lena's silhouette was visible against the fluorescent light. She has recordings. I know about the recordings. Everyone knows about the recordings. And everyone who needs those recordings to disappear is significantly more motivated and significantly more resourced than a motorcycle club and a county sheriff. Briggs stepped forward. Mr. Eckhart, anything you say right now, bum, can and will be used against me. I know. I have attorneys for that. I have attorneys for everything. He turned back to Deacon. You have about 4 minutes before the state police arrive. Hatch called them 20 minutes ago. They'll have their own court order, not from Waring, from the appellate division. And when they get here, your sheriff's discretion disappears, your stall tactics disappear, and your motorcycle club disappears. Ronan heard it through the walls. Every word. He turned to Joanna. How long? 2 recordings, 3 minutes, maybe 4. We don't have 4. I know. Joanna's hands were trembling on the keyboard, sweat on her forehead despite the cold. The upload bar on the screen crawled forward with the agonizing slowness of technology failing at the worst possible moment. The connection keeps dropping. I'm on the 3rd attempt for recording 42. Ronan looked at Lena. She was standing at the window now, watching the parking lot, watching Eckhart, watching the man who had married her mother and killed her father and built a machine designed to erase her from the world while the world watched and documented the process in triplicate. He said state police, Lena said quietly. They'll have a new order. I heard. If they get a new order from a higher court, Briggs can't delay anymore. And the recordings, if they're not uploaded, they'll be uploaded. You don't know that. I know that Joanna hasn't stopped typing since 4:30 in the morning. I know that Deacon is standing between you and that van. I know that 12 people rode through a storm to stand in a parking lot for a girl they've never met. He paused. And I know your father made 43 recordings because he believed someone would fight for you, and he was right. The upload bar moved. 91%. 92. Outside, the sound of engines, not motorcycles, the heavier, more insistent sound of large vehicles approaching on Route 9. Multiple vehicles. Moving fast despite the storm. Briggs heard it too. His head turned toward the highway, and his shoulders dropped an inch. The involuntary response of a man who has been standing on a line that is about to be erased. State police, he said. Multiple units. Deacon didn't move. Pike didn't move. Cora didn't move. The 12 members of the Iron Meridian stood in the rain as headlights appeared on the highway. 3 sets, 4 sets, growing brighter, closer. The cavalry arriving for the wrong side. 94%. Jessup spoke for the first time since Eckhart arrived. I'd suggest your people step aside. Now. Deacon looked at him. The look lasted 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, 22 years of military service, 2 decades of brotherhood leadership, and a lifetime of standing between danger and the people it was coming for compressed into a single expression that contained no words because none were needed. We'll step aside when the girl is safe. She will be safe at our facility. Your facility processes children like raw material, 47 of them, by our count. Deacon's voice carried across the parking lot, loud enough for Briggs, loud enough for the deputies, loud enough for the truckers who had gathered at the edge of the lot to watch. How many of those children have family members who know where they are? How many have been visited? How many have been released? Jessup's jaw clenched. That's defamatory. It's a question. Answer it. The state police cruisers turned into the parking lot. 3 vehicles, lights dark but engines loud. They pulled in behind the van and the sedan, and officers emerged with the efficient, practiced movements of people executing a task they'd been briefed on during the drive. A lieutenant approached, young for his rank, pressed uniform. The particular confidence of state law enforcement interacting with county jurisdiction, not hostile but clear about the hierarchy. Sheriff Briggs, Lieutenant Torres, State Police. I have an appellate court order for the immediate transport of the minor Lena Mercer to Graydon Pines Residential Treatment Center. This order supersedes any local holds or delays. Torres handed over the document. Briggs read it under the neon light, rain running down his face, his expression the stone mask of a man watching the last card played against him. This order was issued at 5:15 a.m., Briggs said, 30 minutes ago, on a Saturday. Emergency Judicial Authorization, Judge Pemberton, 3rd Appellate Division. Judge Pemberton issued an emergency order at 5:15 on a Saturday morning for a custody matter in a county he's never set foot in, based on a petition filed. Briggs checked the document. 12 minutes before the order was signed. I don't make the orders, Sheriff. I execute them. That's what worries me. Torres's expression tightened. Sir, I need to ask you and all civilians to clear the entrance to the establishment. We will execute this transport with minimal disruption, but we will execute it. Inside the diner, Ronan heard everything. He turned to Joanna. Joanna. Recording 42 uploading, 98%. Her voice was raw. Her eyes were locked on the screen with an intensity that could have burned through the monitor. 43 hasn't started yet. Start it! I can't run 2 uploads simultaneously on this connection. It'll crash both. 99%. The front door opened. Torres stepped inside with 2 state officers flanking him. His eyes swept the room, the bikers, the waitress, the laptop on the counter, the girl pressed against the wall by the jukebox. Lena Mercer. Lena didn't answer. She looked at Ronan. Torres walked toward her. Lena, my name is Lieutenant Torres. I have a court order. She knows what a court order is, Ronan said. He stepped between Torres and the girl, not aggressively, not with violence. with the simple, immovable fact of his body occupying the space that Torres needed to reach her. She's had 4 of them used against her in 6 months. Sir, I need you to step aside. In a minute. Now, sir. In a minute. Ronan didn't raise his voice, didn't change his posture, didn't move. He stood the way he'd stood in doorways in Fallujah when the choice was move or die, and moving meant letting something through that shouldn't get through. That laptop is uploading evidence to a federal investigator. 43 recordings made by this girl's father documenting a conspiracy involving Graydon Pines, a fraudulent guardianship network, and the exploitation of minors. When the upload completes, you can execute your order. But if you take her before that evidence is secured, you're not just transporting a child. You're destroying a federal case. Torres hesitated. The hesitation lasted 1 second, barely a breath. But in that second, Ronan saw the calculation happening behind the lieutenant's eyes. The math of a man weighing procedure against conscience, orders against instinct, career against the small, terrifying possibility that the scarred biker standing in front of him might be telling the truth. How long? Torres said. Ronan turned to Joanna. 100%. Recording 42. Complete. Recording 43. The final recording. David Mercer's last message. The upload bar appeared on the screen. 0%. 2 minutes, Joanna said. Torres looked at Ronan, looked at Lena, looked at the laptop. Then he looked at Martin Eckhart, who was now standing inside the diner's entrance with Hatch at his shoulder, both of them radiating the particular fury of men who are accustomed to having their orders executed without question and have just discovered a 2-minute obstacle. Lieutenant, Hatch said, the order is clear. Execute it. Now. 2 minutes, Counselor. The order says immediate. Not in 2 minutes. Immediate. 2 minutes won't change the outcome. It changes the precedent, and I will note every second of delay in my report to the appellate court. Torres's jaw tightened. He turned to his officers, and Ronan could see it happening. The invisible machinery of authority overriding judgment, procedure overriding conscience, the system doing what the system was built to do. Sir, Torres said to Ronan, step aside. Final warning. Ronan didn't step aside. Instead, he did something that would cost him everything. He sat down. On the floor. Between Torres and Lena, cross-legged, hands on his knees. 240 pounds of scar tissue and shrapnel and leather and stubbornness sitting on the cracked linoleum of a roadside diner at 5:42 in the morning, blocking the path to a 13-year-old girl with nothing but his body and his willingness to lose. Torres stared at him. Arrest me, Ronan said. Obstruction. Whatever you want. Add it to the list. But you're going to have to move me first, and that's going to take more than 2 minutes. Behind him, Lena's hand touched his shoulder, light as air, light as a child's hand on the shoulder of the last person standing between her and a van designed to make her disappear. Deacon stepped inside the diner, Pike behind him, Cora behind Pike. One by one, the members of the Iron Meridian filed through the door and arranged themselves behind Ronan. Not in a line, not in formation, but in the organic, instinctive geometry of people who have been a family longer than any court could recognize and who understood without speaking that this was the moment the family earned its name. They sat down. All of them. On the floor, on the stools, leaning against the counter. Filling the space between Torres and Lena with the accumulated weight of 12 bodies and 12 lifetimes of damage and 12 decisions to be here, now, in this diner, for this girl. Torres's radio crackled. He answered it. His face changed. Lieutenant Torres. A voice through the radio. Female. Authoritative. This is Special Agent Dana Whitford, FBI Pittsburgh Field Office. I have an emergency federal hold order for the minor Lena Mercer, superseding all state and county transport directives, effective immediately. The order is being transmitted to your dispatch now. You are instructed to stand down and secure the scene until federal investigators arrive. Do you copy? The diner went silent. Torres lowered his radio, looked at Martin Eckhart, looked at the laptop screen where recording 43's upload bar showed 100% complete, transmitted, received, secured. And Martin Eckhart's face, the smooth, calculated, constructed face that had smiled its way through boardrooms and courtrooms and custody hearings, finally, irreversibly, collapsed. It didn't happen dramatically. There was no outburst, no scream, no theatrical moment of villainy unmasked. It happened the way a building collapses when the foundation gives out. A slow, structural failure that begins in the eyes and moves downward through the muscles of the face until the entire architecture of deception simply stops functioning, and what remains is the blank, exposed foundation of a man who has run out of masks. He looked at Lena, she looked back, and in the space between their eyes, stepfather and stepdaughter, predator and prey, the man who had built a machine to erase her, and the girl who had carried her father's truth through 6 months of darkness. Something final passed. Not words, not threat, not even hatred, just recognition. The mutual acknowledgement that this was over, and that it had been ended not by force, not by law, not by power, but by a dead man's recordings and a living girl's reflection to be silenced, and a broken biker who sat on a diner floor because sitting was the only weapon he had left. Eckhart turned toward the door. Deacon stood in his path. "Where are you going, Martin?" "I'm leaving." "No," Briggs said from behind him. The sheriff's hand was on his cuffs. "No, you're not." And then it happened. The last desperate lunge of a cornered animal. Not at Briggs. Not at Deacon. At the laptop. Eckhart moved with a speed that contradicted everything about his polished, deliberate persona. A burst of pure, unmasked violence driven by the understanding that the laptop still contained the local copies. That even with the upload complete, the physical evidence could be damaged, muddied, challenged in court if the original files were corrupted. He covered 6 feet in a second. His hand swung toward the laptop on the counter. Ronan was already moving. He came off the floor like something unleashed, not standing, launching, 240 pounds of muscle memory and combat training converting from stillness to motion in the space between heartbeats. His shoulder hit Eckhart in the chest, at full extension, driving the smaller man backward across the diner floor, away from the counter, away from the laptop, away from the evidence, and they hit the far wall together with a sound like a car door slamming. Eckhart fought, clawed at Ronan's face, drove an elbow into his ribs. Connected with something that sent a white flash of pain across Ronan's vision. But Ronan had been hit by worse, by shrapnel, by rifle stocks, by the particular violence of hand-to-hand combat in spaces too small for weapons, and he absorbed the blows the way a mountain absorbs weather, without moving, without yielding, without letting go. He pinned Eckhart against the wall with one forearm across his chest, not choking, not striking, containing. The disciplined, precise application of force that the Marine Corps teaches and that the world outside the Corps never understands. The ability to hurt someone and choose not to. Eckhart's eyes were wild. The mask was gone completely now, and behind it was nothing but animal desperation, the thrashing, cornered fury of a man who had spent years constructing a system of control and was watching it disintegrate under the weight of a dead man's voice and a living girl's courage. "Let me go," Eckhart hissed. "No. You have no idea. You don't know what they'll do." "Who's they, Martin?" Eckhart's mouth opened, closed. His eyes darted to the door, to the window, to something beyond the parking lot and the storm and the small town, something out there in the larger darkness that he was more afraid of than the biker pinning him to a diner wall. "You think this ends with me?" he whispered. "You think I'm the top of this? I'm nothing. I'm a franchise operator. There are facilities in 6 states. There are judges in 12 counties. There are—" Briggs was there. Cuffs out. The metal clicked around Eckhart's wrists with a sound that cut through the diner like a period at the end of a very long sentence. "Martin Eckhart, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." Eckhart laughed, broken, hollow. The laugh of a man who knows that silence is the one thing his employers will demand, and the one thing that might keep him alive. Briggs led him toward the door, deputies flanking, state officers watching with the rigid posture of men whose orders had just been overridden by a federal authority and who weren't sure whether to be relieved or alarmed. Ronan stood against the wall where he'd pinned Eckhart. His ribs ached, his knuckles were bleeding from where they'd scraped the plaster. His breath came in ragged pulls, and his heart hammered against his chest like something trying to escape. He turned around. Lena was standing 3 feet away. She had watched the entire thing, the tackle, the restraint, the arrest. She had watched a man twice her size take down her stepfather with controlled, precise violence and hold him without hurting him, and her expression contained something Ronan hadn't seen on her face all night. Not relief. Not yet. Relief was miles away, hours away, weeks of therapy and nightmares and slow reconstruction away. What she wore on her face was something simpler and harder and more fragile than relief. It was the first tentative, barely visible beginning of belief that the adults in her world might not all be liars. Outside, the storm was breaking. The first gray light of dawn bled through the clouds to the east, and the rain softened from assault to whisper, and somewhere on Route 9, the sound of more engines approached. Not state police this time, not transport vans, but the distant, still invisible convoy of federal vehicles moving toward Black Hollow, with the weight of an investigation that would stretch across 6 states and 12 counties, and 47 children who had been swallowed by a system built to consume them. And in a roadside diner that smelled like burnt coffee and wet leather and the particular electricity that hangs in the air after violence, a 13-year-old girl reached out and took the hand of a broken biker who was bleeding from the knuckles and shaking from the adrenaline and crying without sound because the boy in the group home, the one he'd walked away from years ago, had just been given a second chance in the form of a girl who whispered the truth to a stranger and refused to let the world make her disappear. The federal convoy arrived at 6:17 a.m., and the dawn came with it, thin, gray, reluctant, as if the sun itself wasn't sure Black Hollow deserved the light. 4 black SUVs, 2 unmarked sedans, a mobile command vehicle with satellite dishes on the roof and antennae that swayed in the dying wind like metal fingers reaching for a signal. They pulled into the parking lot of Marcy's Diner in formation, tires cutting through standing water, headlights unnecessary now because the sky was doing the work. Barely, grudgingly, but doing it. Special Agent Dana Whitford stepped out of the lead vehicle before it fully stopped. She was mid-40s, short hair, no makeup, a face that looked like it had been designed for efficiency rather than beauty, sharp angles, deep-set eyes, a jaw that could have been cut from the same stone as the mountains ringing Black Hollow. She wore a dark windbreaker with FBI stenciled across the back and moved with the compressed energy of someone who had been waiting 6 months for this moment and was furious it had taken this long. She didn't speak to Briggs first. She didn't speak to Torres. She walked past the state police cruisers, past the white transport van where Jessup and his team sat in handcuffed silence, past the Iron Meridian standing in the gray light with rain still dripping from their leather, and she walked directly to the diner's entrance, where Ronan stood with blood on his knuckles and a bruise forming along his jawline from Eckhart's elbow. "Where's the girl?" Whitford said. "Inside." "And the recordings?" "Uploaded. All 43. Your server." Whitford exhaled, a single controlled breath that contained 6 months of bureaucratic obstruction, a reassignment designed to bury her, a case file transferred to a compromised agent, and a father whose calls she'd stopped receiving because someone above her had decided his life was less valuable than the operation his death protected. "I need to see her," Whitford said. "She needs to see you, too." Ronan paused. "But she decides when." "Not you." Whitford looked at him, at the scars, the leather, the size of him, the blood, the exhaustion that hung on his frame like a second skin. She was FBI. She'd spent her career reading people the way mechanics read engines, looking for the parts that didn't fit, the sounds that didn't belong, the failures waiting to happen. Whatever she read in Ronan's face, it passed her inspection. "Fair enough," she said. She walked inside. Lena was sitting in the booth where this had all started, the same booth where she'd sat hours ago with a cold hot chocolate and a whisper meant for a stranger. The hot chocolate was long gone. The booth was littered with coffee cups and legal documents and the detritus of a night that had consumed everything in the room and left only the people behind. Whitford slid into the seat across from her, didn't extend a hand, didn't introduce herself with a title, just sat. The way Ronan had sat, hours ago, when a girl needed someone to occupy the space across from her without asking for anything in return. "Your father called me 14 times, Whitford said. Her voice was quiet. Not soft. Whitford didn't do soft, but quiet. The volume of someone speaking to a person they owed a debt to. 14 times. I listened every time. I believed him every time. And when they took me off the case, I fought. Not hard enough. Not well enough. But I fought. Lena studied her face, the same way she'd studied Briggs, the same way she'd studied Ronan, the practiced, exhaustive assessment of a child who has learned that the distance between what adults say and what adults do is measured in bodies. Why didn't you come sooner? The question was simple, a child's question, the kind that adults build entire careers around avoiding. Whitford didn't avoid it, because the system I work for failed you, because the people above me prioritized other cases, because I was reassigned and told the matter was closed, and I accepted that reassignment because I was afraid that pushing harder would cost me my career. She paused. And your father died while I was deciding how much my career was worth. The honesty filled the booth like cold water. Not comfortable, not reassuring, just true. The kind of truth that doesn't make anything better but makes everything real. Lena looked at Whitford for a long time. Then she reached across the table and pushed the voice recorder toward her, the battered, tape-wrapped device that her father had hidden in a place only she would find, that she'd carried for 6 months through foster homes and institutions, and a freezing midnight run to a diner in a town that time forgot. He wanted you to have this, Lena said. Whitford picked up the recorder, held it in both hands, looked at it the way you look at something that is simultaneously evidence and elegy, the last physical object a dead man touched before the world took him away from his daughter. I'll take care of it, Whitford said. I know. Lena's voice was steady. That's not why I'm giving it to you. Then why? Because I'm tired of carrying it. The words hit every person within earshot. Ronan, standing by the counter, Deacon by the door, Darlene behind the register with her coffee pot and her reading glasses and her decades of watching Black Hollow consume its own. Even the federal agent setting up equipment in the parking lot seemed to pause, as if the frequency of a 13-year-old girl's exhaustion had traveled through the walls and touched something human in all of them. Whitford nodded, put the recorder in an evidence bag, sealed it, initialed the seal, and then she did something that wasn't in any procedural manual. She placed her hand flat on the table, palm up, the same gesture Ronan had made hours earlier, and left it there. Lena didn't take it, not yet, but she looked at it, and the looking was enough. The next 3 hours were chaos and procedure, and the slow, grinding machinery of justice finally engaging with the truth it had been fed. Federal agents processed the diner as a scene. Statements were taken from everyone. Briggs, Darlene, the 2 truckers who had long since returned out of curiosity, every member of the Iron Meridian. The recordings were authenticated on-site by a forensic audio specialist who arrived in the mobile command vehicle and spent 90 minutes with headphones and spectral analysis software confirming what everyone in the room already knew. David Mercer's voice was real, unedited, and devastating. Arrest warrants were issued before noon. Dr. Vivian Cross was taken into custody at the Motor Lodge on Elm Street, where she had been frantically shredding documents in her room. The motel's housekeeper, a woman named Patty, who had worked there for 11 years and had never liked the look of the woman in room 6, had called Briggs when she heard the sound of a paper shredder running at 6 in the morning. Cross was arrested with 3 garbage bags of confetti and a laptop whose hard drive she'd attempted to wipe. The FBI's digital forensics team recovered 87% of the data within 48 hours. Gerald Hatch was arrested at his office in the county seat where he had been on the phone with Judge Waring attempting to coordinate a response. The call was intercepted under the emergency federal warrant. Both men were taken into custody within an hour of each other. Waring's arrest, a sitting judge in his chambers, in his robes, sent shockwaves through the county legal system that would reverberate for years. Supervisor Renee Dalton turned herself in at 9:42 a.m. She arrived at the sheriff's station alone, without an attorney, carrying a cardboard box full of files she had taken from the CPS office. Files that documented not just Lena's case, but 11 others, 11 children whose guardianship had been transferred through the same network, the same fraudulent evaluations, the same bought judges and compliant supervisors. She gave a full statement that lasted 4 hours. She cried through most of it, not the tears of remorse exactly, but the tears of a woman who had been drowning in complicity for so long that breathing clean air was physically painful. Martin Eckhart, Martin Dressler, said nothing. He invoked his right to counsel and sat in a holding cell with the blank, calculated silence of a man who understood that the people above him were listening and that his continued survival depended on his continued silence. But the recordings spoke for him, all 43 of them. David Mercer's voice from beyond the grave, methodically, exhaustively, heartbreakingly documenting every meeting, every transaction, every threat, every casual cruelty that a man in a tailored suit had inflicted on a family he had targeted for their land. The investigation expanded within days. Whitford's team followed the threads from Black Hollow outward, through the shell companies, through the holding firms, through the financial architecture that connected Graydon Pines to 5 other residential facilities in 4 states. The network was larger than anyone in the diner that night had imagined, larger than David Mercer had known, larger than the 47 children he'd documented. The final count, when it came months later, was 63. 63 children processed through fraudulent guardianship transfers. 63 families destroyed by a system that had been weaponized against them. 63 files that had been opened, documented, processed, and closed by institutions that were supposed to protect the vulnerable and had instead consumed them. Of those 63, 41 were recovered, located, returned to family members, or placed in legitimate care. 22 had aged out of the system, scattered across the country, carrying damage that no investigation could repair. But 41 were found. 41 children who had been disappeared by paperwork and silence were brought back into the world because a 13-year-old girl whispered 5 words to a stranger in a diner. Ronan didn't see most of it happen. He wasn't part of the investigation. He wasn't called to testify in the early proceedings. He gave his statement, submitted to questioning, answered every question Whitford's team asked with the flat, exhaustive honesty of a man who had nothing to hide and nothing to protect except a girl who no longer needed him to protect her. That was the hardest part. Not the night in the diner, not the confrontation with Eckhart, not the moment he sat down on the floor and dared the state police to move him. Those were easy. Those were the things he'd been built for. The violence, the resistance, the stubborn, physical refusal to yield. The hard part was the morning after, when the federal agents took over and the Iron Meridian mounted their bikes and the diner slowly emptied, and Lena was escorted to a federal vehicle that would take her to a safe house while the investigation unfolded. The hard part was watching her walk across the parking lot, small, exhausted, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't his, and understanding that his role in her survival was over, that the system, for once, was doing what the system was supposed to do, that the best thing he could do for her now was step back and let the machinery of justice grind in the right direction for a change. She stopped at the car, turned, looked across the parking lot at Ronan, who stood by his Harley with his hands in his jacket pockets and the dawn light catching the gray in his beard. She didn't wave, didn't call out. She just looked at him, a long, steady look that contained everything a 13-year-old girl couldn't say to a man she'd known for 4 hours and trusted with her life. Then she got in the car, and the door closed, and the vehicle pulled away, and Ronan watched the taillights until they disappeared around the bend on Route 9. He stood in the parking lot for a long time after that. Deacon found him there, stood beside him. 2 men in the gray morning light, soaking wet, bone-tired, standing in the wreckage of a night that had changed something neither of them had expected to change. "You gonna ride?" Deacon asked. "In a minute." "Where?" Ronan didn't answer immediately. He looked at the diner, at the neon sign with the burned-out A, at the booth by the window where a girl had sat alone with a cold hot chocolate and a secret that could have died with her. "Home," he said. Deacon looked at him. "You don't have a home, Grizzly." "I know." Ronan paused. "Maybe it's time I did." The silence between them was different now. Not the silence of distance, the silence of proximity, of 2 people standing close enough to share air and choosing, after 3 years of choosing otherwise, not to pull away. "The club needs a mechanic," Deacon said. "Pike's garage. He's been running it alone since Carter died. He won't admit it, but he can't keep up." "Pike doesn't want me there." "Pike doesn't know what he wants. He knows what he lost. That's different." Ronan looked at the line of motorcycles parked in the lot. 12 bikes, rain-washed, road-scarred, each one belonging to a person who had ridden through a freezing storm in the middle of the night because he'd made a phone call he didn't deserve to make. I walked out, Deacon. I left without explaining, without asking. I left a note on the bar and rode away because I couldn't. He stopped. The words snagged on something sharp inside his throat. Because I couldn't carry the weight of the brothers we lost and the weight of being alive at the same time. I know why you left. Deacon's voice was low, rough, the voice of a man who had carried the weight Ronan dropped and was still carrying it and would carry it until the day he stopped breathing because that was what presidents did. You left because you thought leaving would stop the pain, and it didn't. It just made you carry it alone. Ronan felt the words land in the center of his chest like a key turning in a lock he'd forgotten existed. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Deacon had already said the thing that 3 years of silence had been trying to say. Come home, Grizzly. Deacon put a hand on his shoulder. Heavy, warm. The weight of a hand that had pulled men out of wreckage and held brothers through funerals and gripped handlebars through storms that should have killed them. We're still here. Ronan closed his eyes. The rain had stopped. The air smelled like wet asphalt and pine, and the particular cleanness that follows a storm that spent itself. In the distance, a truck engine rumbled on the highway. The diner's kitchen had started up again. He could smell bacon, coffee, the mundane machinery of a morning that had no idea what had happened in this parking lot over the last 4 hours. Okay, he said. One word. Barely audible. But Deacon heard it, and the hand on Ronan's shoulder tightened, and something between them, something that had been broken for 3 years, didn't heal. Healing would take longer, but it shifted. The way bones shift when they're set, painful, necessary. The first step in a process that would take months of sitting at the same table and riding the same roads and being present for the silence that exists between people who have hurt each other and chosen to stay anyway. 3 months later, Ronan was elbow-deep in a transmission rebuild at Pike's garage when a car pulled into the gravel lot. He didn't look up immediately. The garage had become his life in the weeks since he'd come back. A cinder-block building on the outskirts of Black Ridge that smelled like motor oil and welding flux and the particular combination of metal and heat that happens when someone is taking things apart and putting them back together. Pike worked the left bay. Ronan worked the right. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The work was the conversation, the shared language of wrenches and torque specifications, and the physical labor of fixing things that were broken. Pike had said 9 words to him on his first day back. Bay 2, tools are in the cabinet, coffee's hot. That was 3 months ago. Since then, the word count had increased marginally. They'd graduated to discussing parts orders, weather, and on one occasion that felt like a breakthrough, whether the diner across the road made better pie than the one on Route 11. Pike said Route 11. Ronan said the diner. They hadn't resolved it. They probably never would. And that was fine. That was the architecture of a relationship being rebuilt one brick at a time, without blueprints, without deadlines, without the expectation that it would ever look like what it had been before. Because it wouldn't. It would look like something else, something built on top of the rubble of what was lost. The car door opened and closed. Footsteps on gravel. Light footsteps. Too light for an adult. Ronan wiped his hands on a shop rag and turned around. Lena stood at the edge of the garage bay. She was taller than he remembered. 3 months of not running, not hiding, not calculating escape routes from every room she entered had changed her posture. She stood straight now, shoulders back, chin level, the physical language of a person who occupied space because she had a right to it, not because she was measuring how quickly she could vacate it. Behind her, a woman in her 50s leaned against the car, dark hair streaked with gray, kind eyes, the worn hands of someone who worked with her body. Naomi Mercer, Lena's aunt, the woman who had tried twice to get custody and been denied twice by a court that was designed to deny her. The third attempt had succeeded. Whitford had personally testified at the hearing. The judge, not Waring, who was awaiting trial, had granted permanent custody in 17 minutes, the fastest guardianship approval in the county's history. Lena was carrying something, a flat, rectangular object wrapped in brown paper. She held it against her chest with both hands, the way she'd held her backpack in the diner, protectively, preciously, as if the thing she carried was fragile in a way that mattered. "Hey," she said. "Hey." She looked at the garage, at the bikes in various stages of repair, at Pike, who had emerged from bay, one wiping his hands and looking at Lena with an expression that Ronan had never seen on his face before, tender and terrified at the same time. The expression of a man looking at a living child and seeing the ghost of the one he'd lost, and being grateful and gutted in equal measure. "This is Pike," Ronan said. "I know," Lena said. "Deacon told me about him." She looked at Pike directly. "He told me about Ruby." Pike's jaw tightened. He nodded once. Didn't speak. Couldn't speak, possibly, because the sound of his daughter's name in the mouth of a girl who had survived the same system that killed her was a frequency his body didn't know how to process. Lena walked to Pike, stood in front of him. This girl who had spent 6 months being talked over and talked about and talked at by adults who never once stopped to listen. This girl looked up at a grieving father and said the only thing that mattered. She would have been proud of you for showing up that night. Pike's face crumbled. Not collapsed, crumbled, the way a wall crumbles when you remove the one brick that was holding the rest in place. His eyes filled. His mouth pressed into a line so tight it disappeared. His shoulders shook once, twice, and then he turned away and walked into the garage bay with his hand over his face and his body bent at the waist like something inside him had finally broken loose after 4 years of being held in place by sheer grinding refusal to feel it. Ronan let him go. Some things need to happen in private. Some grief needs to be felt without an audience. Some men need to walk into an empty garage bay and put their hands on an engine block and cry because a 13-year-old girl just said the thing their dead daughter never got the chance to say. Lena turned back to Ronan. Her eyes were wet now, too, not from her own grief, but from the recognition that grief is a shared thing, a human thing, a thread that connects people who have lost different things in the same kind of darkness. She held out the wrapped package. "I made this," she said. "For you." Ronan took it. His grease-stained hands left prints on the brown paper as he unwrapped it, carefully. The way you unwrap something when you can feel that it matters before you can see what it is. A framed charcoal drawing. The detail was extraordinary. A rain-soaked diner at night, neon sign buzzing with a missing letter, parking lot flooded, sky apocalyptic. Through the front window, a booth, a small girl sitting on one side, a massive biker sitting on the other, his scarred hands flat on the table, mirroring hers. The scale was perfect. The contrast was devastating. A giant and a child, separated by a table, connected by the simple act of sitting across from each other in a world that had failed them both. Outside the diner, barely visible through the rain, the silhouettes of motorcycles in the parking lot. Not threatening, present. The suggestion of a family assembled in the dark, waiting, ready, there. Across the bottom of the drawing, in careful handwriting that was steadier than it had been 3 months ago, Lena had written, "You believed me before you believed the lies." Ronan held the drawing, looked at it, looked at the girl who had made it, and felt something move inside his chest. Not break, not crack, not rupture. Move. The way tectonic plates move. The slow, massive, irreversible shifting of something fundamental that changes the landscape above it forever. He didn't cry, not quite. His eyes burned and his throat closed and his hands shook on the frame, but he held it together the way he'd held everything together for 46 years, with stubbornness, with discipline, with the Marine Corps conviction that if you lock your jaw and breathe through your nose, you can survive anything. But his face gave him away. It always did. The faces of men who've been through wars are honest in ways their words will never be, and Lena read his face the way she'd read every face that night, not for what it showed, but for what it couldn't hide. "Thank you," he said. The words came out rough, broken at the edges, insufficient in the way that words are always insufficient when they're trying to carry feelings that were built for something larger than language. Lena stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist. He stood there for a moment, frozen, his arms out to the sides, the framed drawing in one hand, the shop rag in the other. A 6'4" biker covered in grease and scars being hugged by a 13-year-old girl who had decided, without permission, without hesitation, without the careful calculation that had governed every interaction she'd had with adults for the last 6 months, that this person was safe. He put one arm around her shoulders, gently, the way you hold something that has been broken and is healing and needs to know that it's being held without being squeezed. They stood like that for 5 seconds, maybe 6, long enough for Naomi to see from the car and press her hand to her mouth, long enough for Pike to emerge from Bay 1 with red eyes and a wrench in his hand and stop in the doorway and watch, long enough for the moment to exist in the air between them, finite, imperfect, unrepeatable, and settle into both of them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples in every direction. Then Lena stepped back, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and smiled. Not the guarded, strategic smile of a girl managing her environment, a real smile. The kind that costs something because it requires trust, and trust requires the belief that the person you're smiling at won't use it against you. Naomi says I can visit on weekends, she said. If that's okay. That's okay. I'm learning to draw engines. They're harder than faces. Everything's harder than faces. That's not true. Faces are the hardest thing. She paused. Because you have to draw what's underneath, not just what's on top. Ronan looked at the drawing in his hands, at the biker in the booth, at the girl across from him, at the rain and the neon and the motorcycles in the dark. Yeah, he said. I guess that's right. Lena visited every Saturday after that. She'd sit on an overturned crate in the corner of the garage and draw while Ronan and Pike worked on engines. She drew the bikes, the tools, the coffee mugs with their rings of permanent stain. She drew Pike's hands, scarred, grease-blackened, precise, and he didn't notice until she showed him, and he held the drawing for a long time without speaking, and then taped it to the wall above his workbench next to a photograph of Ruby that had been hanging there alone for 4 years. She drew Deacon once, sitting on his Road King in the parking lot with the sun behind him and his shadow stretching across the gravel like something longer and older than the man who cast it. Deacon looked at the drawing and said, "You made me look like I know what I'm doing." And Lena said, "You do. You just don't believe it yet." And Deacon laughed, a real laugh, deep and startled and full. And the sound of it rolled across the parking lot and through the open bay doors and into the garage where Ronan was working alone, and heard it and smiled at nothing and no one, because the sound of laughter in a place that had known too much silence was its own kind of repair. Ronan hung the diner drawing above his workbench. It hung there through the summer and into the fall and through the following winter. People who came to the garage for repairs would sometimes look at it and ask what it meant, and Ronan would say, "It's a long story," and leave it at that. But sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the garage was empty and the light came through the bay doors at a low angle, and the world outside was still, he'd stand in front of the drawing and look at the girl in the booth and the biker across from her, and remember the sound of a dead man's voice on a tape recorder at 2 a.m, and the weight of a child's hand in his, and the feeling of sitting on a cold linoleum floor with 12 brothers and sisters behind him, and the entire machinery of a broken system in front of him, and choosing, for the first time in years, not to walk away. People still judged him by the leather, the scars, the tattoos, the size of him filling a doorway like a storm front. But every child who walked into that garage knew one thing. If they whispered the truth, he would hear it. This story is entirely fictional and created solely for artistic and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, organizations, locations, and details are original works of fiction and bear no relation to any real person, organization, or actual event.